On the morning of the 12th of March 1971, a twin-jet passenger aircraft lifted from a small regional runway and climbed steadily into clear skies. Its departure was routine, its crew experienced, its passengers unaware they were stepping into one of the strangest aviation mysteries ever recorded. Within an hour, the flight vanished from radar screens. No distress call, no trail of wreckage, just silence, sudden and absolute. For families, the waiting began that day and never ended. Search teams scoured coastlines and seas, but the jet seemed to have dissolved into the sky itself. Officials offered little beyond words of procedure, extended search, continuing efforts, but weeks turned to years, and the case faded into unresolved history. Then, in the summer of 2004, something impossible happened. On a frequency used by civilian aircraft, controllers heard a voice. Calm, professional, unmistakably belonging to the missing flight. It reported altitude, fuel, and heading as if 3 decades had never passed. What happened to the plane that took off in 1971? Tonight, we'll step carefully through the silence, the evidence, and the possibilities into a mystery that, like the jet itself, refuses to land. On a crisp spring morning in 1971, a mid-range passenger jet lifted from a regional runway, its silver body glinting in the sunday. The departure was routine, the voices on the radio calm, the checklist complete. Yet within an hour, the aircraft slipped from radar screens as though erased from existence. No distress call, no trail of debris, only a sudden and unnerving silence. The route it was flying was not unusual. It connected 2 mid-sized cities, a distance of a little more than 600 miles. Families, business travelers, and tourists were on board, expecting nothing more than a short, uneventful flight. The weather was kind to them, clear skies, good visibility, no storms forecast. In aviation terms, it was nearly perfect. The first 30 minutes were smooth. The crew checked in with controllers, reported their climb to cruising altitude, and acknowledged their airway assignment. The last words from the cockpit were calm, routine, and professional. Then the radar blip vanished. There was no fading, no loss of signal strength. One moment it was there, the next it was gone. Controllers immediately attempted to raise the aircraft, broadcasting on multiple frequencies. Other planes in the area were asked if they had seen anything unusual. Pilots nearby reported clear skies, no flashes, no smoke, no debris. It was as though the aircraft had been plucked out of the air in a single instant. Search operations began within hours. Naval vessels swept coastal waters, helicopters scanned rivers and valleys. Fixed-wing aircraft flew grid patterns across hundreds of square miles. Yet despite the scale of the search, nothing surfaced. No wreckage, no oil slick, no life jackets. Each report filed at the end of the day contained the same bleak phrase: negative findings. Investigators combed through the background of the flight. The captain was highly experienced, with over 8,000 hours logged. The first officer had nearly 3,000. The aircraft had been inspected the day before. Maintenance logs were clean, engines recently serviced, airframe hours well within safe limits. There was nothing to suggest a mechanical failure of the kind that could obliterate a plane without warning. The absence of a distress call was the detail that unsettled investigators most. Even in catastrophic failures, pilots are trained to key the microphone, to broadcast a single word or a last known position. Here there was nothing, not a clipped syllable, not even static from an open mic. Silence can sometimes speak louder than noise, and in this case, it suggested something instantaneous, something beyond the ordinary rhythms of disaster. Weeks of searching turned into months. Families gathered at airports and later at memorials, waiting for answers that never came. The passengers were eventually declared dead in absentia, but the ruling provided no closure. How could an entire aircraft vanish without a trace in an age of radar, radio, and coordinated airspace? For officials, the disappearance was eventually filed as probable accident with unknown cause. For families, it was an open wound. For investigators, it became one more case consigned to the long list of aviation mysteries. The search ended, the headlines faded, but questions remained. The skies had been clear, the pilots were steady, the aircraft was sound, and yet, in the span of a single breath, it was gone. Decades later, when a voice returned on the airwaves as if no time had passed, the silence of 1971 became something else. Entirely an echo that still refuses to fade. In the summer of 2004, air traffic controllers monitoring routine frequencies heard a call sign that should not have existed. The voice identified itself with clarity, reporting altitude and heading as if it was still 1971. Static crackled, but the message carried details only the lost crew could have known. Was it a hoax, or the echo of a plane adrift in time? The incident unfolded on an otherwise ordinary day. Controllers at a coastal facility were running through routine schedules, their screens glowing with the predictable dance of commercial flights. Then, a signal cut across the channel, calm, professional, and precise. The call sign matched the very flight that had vanished 3 decades earlier. The pilot's tone was unmistakably that of a trained aviator. He reported altitude, 31,000 feet, and heading south by southeast. He requested weather confirmation for a waypoint that no longer existed in current charts, one that had been decommissioned in the late 1980 seconds. Every phrase carried the clipped professionalism of a crew speaking in the language of the early 1970 seconds. At first, controllers assumed it was interference, a pirate transmission, perhaps a prankster with old equipment, but details kept surfacing that no casual impersonator could know. The voice referred to a fuel estimate in pounds, not kilograms, matching the exact operational practice of the airline in 1971. He requested confirmation of Sector 4 traffic, a term phased out decades earlier. Even his phrasing of the word affirmative echoed a training style archived in cockpit recordings from that era. Efforts were made to respond. Controllers broadcast instructions, asking the flight to state its position. There was no reply. The voice continued for a few more moments, steady and calm, as if addressing an environment that had not changed since the Nixon administration. Then, mid-sentence, the transmission dissolved into distortion. The channel cleared, and modern traffic resumed as though nothing had occurred. When the tape was replayed, investigators noted anomalies. The background contained the steady drone of jet engines, but not the kind familiar to 2000s aircraft. Analysts identified the tonal frequency of older turbojets, phased out of commercial service by the mid-1980 seconds. There was also a faint clicking noise, consistent with analog cockpit instrument sounds absent in modern digital glass cockpits. Attempts to trace the source brought only more questions. Direction-finding equipment triangulated the signal to a patch of open water, hundreds of miles from any registered aircraft. No radar returns matched. The sky was empty, yet the radio told a different story. For families of those declared lost in 1971, the revelation was devastating. Some dismissed it as a cruel trick, others wept, convinced they had heard the voice of fathers, brothers, or sons preserved in some unreachable limbo. A daughter of one passenger told a local newspaper, "That was his voice. Calm, steady, just like when he read me bedtime stories. I know it." Officials handled the matter quietly. The intercept was logged, the audio preserved, but public statements were vague. Spokesmen attributed the incident to radio interference and moved on. But within closed circles, the recording was replayed again and again. Experts argued over whether such a broadcast could be artificially generated. No conclusive explanation emerged. Was it an elaborate hoax using vintage equipment? Was it a technical echo, bouncing through layers of atmosphere like light through glass? Or was it something stranger, a brief alignment of times, where voices from 1971 slipped into the summer air of 2004? The broadcast lasted less than 90 seconds. Yet, in that short span, it reopened a mystery many thought buried. The silence of 3 decades was broken, not by answers, but by questions whispered through static. And if one call could cross the years, investigators wondered, what else might return from the sky? The early 1970 seconds were a golden yet fragile age of flight. Wide bodies were just entering service, while smaller carriers relied on trusted turboprops and jets like the DC-9. Airports buzzed with optimism, but radar coverage was patchy outside metropolitan hubs. The vanished flight was not unique in its route, but in its aftermath, it left no trace at all. To understand the weight of what happened, it helps to imagine the skies of that era. In 1971, flying was still new enough to feel glamorous. Passengers dressed for the occasion, walking across open tarmacs toward gleaming fuselages painted in bright livery. Airline magazines promised a future of supersonic travel, while advertisements showed smiling crews serving meals on real china. Radar, for instance, was far from complete. Controllers in major hubs like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles could follow aircraft with precision, but once a plane left those regions, especially over water or remote terrain, coverage became intermittent. Large gaps remained where crews relied on dead reckoning, celestial navigation, and radio beacons scattered across the landscape. A blip could vanish from a screen, and no one would know whether it was equipment failure, pilot error, or something far stranger. The planes themselves were sturdy but limited. Narrow-body jets, like the Boeing 727 or the DC-9, were workhorses of short and medium-haul routes. Their cockpits were filled with analog dials, switches, and needles, instruments that required constant cross-checking. Black boxes existed, but they were primitive by today's standards, recording only short loops of cockpit audio and basic flight data. Recovering them after a crash was difficult, and in cases where wreckage was never found, those voices were lost entirely. Safety standards, though improving, were still evolving. Smoke detectors were rare in cabins. GPS did not exist. Communication was conducted entirely through VHF and HF radio, often plagued with static. Pilots frequently noted that transmissions could vanish mid-sentence when ionospheric conditions shifted. To passengers, these gaps were invisible. To controllers, they were routine frustrations, yet it was in these spaces, these blind zones of the sky, that mysteries could take root. Economically, 1971 was a year of transition. The jet age had matured, but competition was fierce. Smaller carriers struggled to keep up with giants like Pan Am or TWA, often flying older fleets longer than recommended. Accidents were rare, but when they happened, the ripple effects could shutter entire companies. That risk meant airlines sometimes minimized troubling incidents, leaving questions unanswered. The vanished flight of 1971 fit uncomfortably into this environment. Its aircraft was not unusual. Its crew was not inexperienced. Its route was neither exotic nor especially dangerous. What made it extraordinary was not how it departed, but how it disappeared. For investigators at the time, this absence clashed with the narrative of progress that aviation was trying to sell. The skies were supposed to be conquered, the technology advanced enough to prevent total vanishing acts. And yet, one did occur. Looking back, the case highlights how thin the line between confidence and uncertainty truly was. Passengers boarding in 1971 stepped into cabins that felt futuristic. But behind the polished service and painted slogans lay vulnerabilities. Vast stretches of airspace went unwatched. Radios crackled unreliably. Black boxes were fallible. A sudden anomaly could erase a plane from the record, leaving behind little more than grief and speculation. The golden age of flight was never as solid as it appeared, and when the call sign of the missing flight echoed back across the airwaves more than 30 years later, it was not just a voice returning. It was a reminder of how fragile that golden age truly had been. Meteorological records from that day show no storms, no electrical disturbances, no atmospheric chaos. Pilots reported smooth air and long visibility horizons. When planes disappear under such favourable skies, investigators find themselves stripped of their most common explanations, which made this absence more chilling still. In aviation, weather is often the first suspect. A sudden thunderstorm, a wall of towering cumulonimbus, or the invisible turbulence of a jet stream can push even experienced crews to the edge of disaster. Lightning strikes, hail damage, microbursts, these forces have claimed aircraft with little warning. The skies were calm, painted with only thin cirrus clouds, the kind that streak across the horizon without menace. Meteorological logs preserved from that day confirm the calm. Temperature gradients were stable, winds moderate, visibility stretching over 20 miles in all directions. Radios crackled with reports from other pilots cruising the same corridors. Smooth ride today. Clear all the way through. not a single warning was issued. In aviation terms, it was the kind of day crews welcomed a chance to follow routine without distraction. Investigators reviewing the case had little to work with. In storm-related accidents, there are usually clues. Lightning scars on wreckage, radar echoes of violent cells, or distress calls describing turbulence. Here, there was none of that. The absence of weather hazards stripped away one of the most common explanations for mid-air disappearance. It forced attention elsewhere, onto factors that were far less satisfying and far more unsettling. Forensic meteorologists were asked to re-examine atmospheric records, hoping to find something overlooked. They studied temperature shifts, upper-level wind charts, and solar activity from that week. Even the possibility of geomagnetic storms was considered, events that sometimes disrupt communications or distort compasses. Yet solar indices showed nothing remarkable, no flare, no disturbance strong enough to interfere with a modern aircraft's navigation. The strange paradox became clear. The very perfection of the day was what made the disappearance so haunting. Pilots are trained to expect challenges in storms, to anticipate difficulties when conditions turn hostile. But when skies are calm and instruments steady, there is no reason to prepare for catastrophe. It is precisely on days like these that a sudden vanishing becomes hardest to rationalize. For families of the missing, the reports added to their torment. It was a perfect day. Ideal conditions, no explanation. The phrase was repeated in headlines, reinforcing the eerie contradiction. If the weather had been violent, at least the disaster would have a context. But instead, the smoothness of the air only deepened the void of answers. In the years since, theorists have tried to build possibilities from this silence. Some suggest subtle atmospheric effects, pockets of clear air turbulence or rare lensing phenomena that could bend radio waves. Others reach further, imagining windows in the sky, places where reality itself thins under conditions that look deceptively calm. None of these explanations satisfy the rigor of science, but the absence of weather hazards leaves room for speculation. Ultimately, the weather records from 1971 became one of the most immovable facts of the case. Clear skies, calm winds, no storms. The investigators, stripped of their usual suspects, were left with an unnerving truth. If nature was not to blame, then something else had silenced the flight. And in the void left behind, the question lingered. What kind of force could erase a plane so completely on a day when nothing in the sky should have stood in its way? Logbooks reveal that the captain had logged over 8,000 flying hours, many across the same corridor. The first officer was younger, but well-trained, and the cabin crew had flown the route dozens of times. This was no rookie flight, yet their voices would not be heard again until decades later, when the world had moved on without them. The captain, a veteran of both military service and civil aviation, was regarded as disciplined and precise. Colleagues described him as steady. The kind of pilot who followed procedure to the letter, never improvising unless safety required it. His career had spanned the early jet age, and he had seen firsthand how quickly technology could change. By 1971, he was deeply familiar with the aircraft he commanded and the airways it traversed. The first officer, while younger, had already gained a reputation as capable and ambitious. He had logged thousands of hours in turboprops before moving into jets. Training reports noted his quick responses under pressure and his habit of double-checking navigational inputs. Pilots in training often made small errors with headings or altitudes, but his evaluations showed consistency. He was considered an officer with potential for captaincy within a few years. The cabin crew, too, were seasoned. They had flown the route many times, knew the rhythms of boarding, the meal service, and the small details that kept passengers calm. Interviews with surviving colleagues described them as reassuring presences, people who could settle nervous flyers with a smile, who understood how to manage turbulence or delays with grace. Their professionalism formed the invisible framework of trust that every flight depends upon. Investigators looked hard at the crew in the aftermath, searching for human error. In aviation, mistakes often begin with small oversights, a checklist skipped, a misread instrument, a misunderstood instruction. Yet nothing in the crew's records suggested carelessness. Maintenance notes confirmed the captain's reputation for thorough pre-flight inspections. Testimonies from other pilots recalled his habit of rehearsing emergency procedures out loud, even on short flights. The first officer's files contained no disciplinary actions, no unexplained gaps in training. If anything, they suggested a team that leaned toward caution rather than risk. The radio transmissions from the flight's early minutes reinforced this impression. The captain's voice was calm, his cadence measured. Each acknowledgement to air traffic control was delivered with clarity, no sign of stress. The first officer's call-outs were precise, confirming altitudes and headings. To the trained ear, these brief exchanges revealed a cockpit functioning exactly as it should, a well-rehearsed team working in rhythm, alert but not anxious. That normalcy made their disappearance harder to explain. Catastrophic failures usually leave a trace in the voice. Pilots under duress reveal stress in clipped tones, in words that carry urgency. But here, the final transmission contained none of that. It was a routine acknowledgement, indistinguishable from hundreds of others the same crew had made on similar flights. Then, nothing. For the families, the crew's professionalism was both a comfort and a torment. It was reassuring to know their loved ones had been in capable hands, but devastating to realize that even the best training and experience had offered no protection. In the years that followed, relatives clung to the image of calm voices in the cockpit, men and women who had done everything right, only to vanish into silence. Decades later, when a voice returned across the airwaves, some said they recognized the tone immediately. It was steady, calm, unshaken. The same professionalism carried forward from 1971 into a world 3 decades older. If true, it meant the crew had remained exactly who they were. Experienced aviators, unaware that time itself had betrayed them, and it left behind the chilling thought that even mastery of the skies could not shield them from what came next. Newspapers of 1971 captured anguished families gathered at the airport lounge, clutching photographs and waiting for updates that never came. Airline spokesmen spoke of extended searches and ongoing rescue efforts, but days turned into weeks. To lose someone to the skies is grief. To lose them without answers is torment. In the first hours after the plane vanished, hope was still alive. Families crowded into waiting rooms, scanning television screens and listening for announcements over muffled loudspeakers. Airline representatives repeated phrases designed to calm, "No confirmation yet, we are optimistic, search efforts continue." But beneath the careful words was the reality that no one could locate the missing aircraft. Photographs from those days showed tired faces lit by fluorescent bulbs, children curled asleep across rows of plastic seats, and parents staring at doors that never opened. Some carried flowers, intending to greet loved ones who would never arrive. Others clutched letters or souvenirs meant as gifts. In every hand there was something unfinished, waiting to be given. Now frozen in time, the days stretched unbearably. Each sunrise carried the possibility of news, but each sunset ended in silence. Airline staff offered vouchers for hotels, food, and phone calls, but nothing could soften the gnawing uncertainty. Grief can take root when death is certain. It is far harder to bear when death is only suspected. The families found themselves trapped between hope and despair, unable to grieve fully, yet unable to believe in reunion. As weeks passed, newspapers began to change their tone. Early optimism gave way to headlines that spoke of slim chances and no evidence of survivors. The official search expanded, then narrowed, then quietly wound down. Families who had once been shielded by reassurances were now forced to confront the unthinkable. That their loved ones were gone, and that no explanation would follow. Some reacted with anger. Airline offices were besieged with phone calls demanding answers. Letters were written to government agencies, to embassies, even to the president. Others turned inward, clinging to faith or ritual, trying to build meaning from a loss that seemed senseless. Support groups formed, unofficial at first, where relatives met to share information and console each other. The torment was compounded by the lack of closure. In ordinary accidents, however tragic, there are funerals, remains to bury, a marker on which to place flowers. Here there was nothing, no wreckage, no graves, only names printed in memorial notices. Families were left with empty coffins, symbolic services, and the endless ache of unfinished goodbyes. Children grew up without parents. Spouses carried on lives, defined by an absence that never healed. In interviews years later, one widow admitted she kept her husband's shoes by the door for more than a decade, unable to put them away. "I thought if I moved them, I'd be admitting he was never coming home," she said. When, decades later, word spread of a mysterious radio call in 2004, it reopened these old wounds. For some, it sparked anger that the past had been disturbed. For others, it was a cruel twist of hope, a suggestion that perhaps their loved ones had lived on in some unreachable place. The grief of 1971 had never fully healed, and the echo of that voice carried it into a new generation. For those families, suspended grief became a way of life. The silence of the vanished flight did not end with the closing of the search. It carried forward into living rooms, dinner tables, and quiet nights. And when the world moved on, they remained caught in the stillness, waiting for answers that never came. Naval craft swept the suspected crash corridor. Helicopters hovered over coastlines. Divers combed bays and river mouths. Search logs from that month read like a slow surrender, line after line of negative findings. Within hours of the disappearance, search and rescue protocols swung into motion. Flight paths were reconstructed from the last radar contact. Estimated fuel reserves were calculated to establish the possible range of the missing jet. Dozens of aircraft were dispatched, flying grid patterns over hundreds of square miles. On the ocean below, naval vessels dragged sonar arrays, listening for echoes of wreckage. The first day carried urgency. Crews leaned against windows, scanning the waves for glimmers of metal or floating debris. Helicopter pilots traced coastlines, hoping for life rafts or survivors clinging to wreckage. Radios buzzed with updates, each one a possibility. But by evening, nothing had been found. As the days passed, the scope widened. Inland areas were searched, dense forests, winding rivers, remote lakes. The possibility that the aircraft had diverted off course into rugged terrain was considered. Teams of divers descended into bays, their lights cutting through dark waters, surfacing only with mud and silt. Each negative report deepened the mystery. In maritime accidents, even partial wreckage is almost always found. A seat cushion washed ashore, a fuel slick spreading across the surface. Even small aircraft crashes usually leave fragments. Yet here, the sea gave back nothing. It was as though the missing jet had been erased, leaving behind no trace of its existence. Logbooks from the search are stark reading. Each page records coordinates covered, times logged, conditions noted, and on nearly every line, the same words: negative findings. Crews rotated in and out, exhausted from long hours over featureless seas, but no one reported even a false sighting. Not a flare, not a signal, not a scrap of cloth. Investigators grew uneasy. Aircraft cannot simply vanish. Even in catastrophic failures, physics demands debris. An explosion scatters wreckage. A water impact leaves an oil slick. A forced ditching produces rafts, flares, survivors. The lack of evidence challenged the very fundamentals of aviation investigation. Families of the missing followed the reports closely. Each day of searching offered a sliver of hope, yet each evening's press briefing chipped away at it. Airline spokesmen repeated phrases like, "We remain committed," and expanding search areas. But the reality grew harder to disguise. As one journalist wrote, "They are searching not for survivors, but for confirmation that anything remains." After weeks of fruitless effort, the official search was scaled back. The announcement came quietly, framed as a transition to ongoing monitoring. For families, it felt like abandonment. For investigators, it felt like defeat. Privately, some officials admitted they were baffled. Planes don't just disappear, one search commander noted, but this one did. Others speculated that strong currents might have dragged wreckage far from the flight path, dispersing evidence beyond reach. Yet even then, the absence of any floating debris remained implausible. The sea, indifferent and vast, had kept its silence. In the years that followed, small expeditions were launched by private groups, hoping to succeed where official efforts had failed. None ever reported credible findings. The case joined the ranks of unresolved disappearances, a reminder that despite technology, the skies and seas still hold places where answers do not surface. The search that began with urgency ended in silence. And in that silence grew the suspicion that the missing jet had not met an ordinary fate at all. Air traffic control transcripts from the day stop mid-sentence. Pilots normally chatter with routine position reports, course checks, or even casual words. Here, the final line is abrupt, mundane, and then nothing. The next sound would not be heard until the dawn of the 21st century. The recordings from 1971 are unsettling not because they reveal panic, but because they don't. The final words from the cockpit were ordinary. An acknowledgement of a frequency change, the kind of phrase repeated thousands of times a day in controlled skies. Controllers expected the voice to return within minutes on the new channel. It never did. In aviation, silence is rarely absolute. Even in emergencies, pilots are trained to transmit something, anything. A single word, a squawk code, even the sound of an open microphone is enough to leave a trace. These fragments often become crucial clues in reconstructing what went wrong. But here, no fragment survived. The line went dead, with no sign of struggle, no clipped syllable, no static rush of a key pressed too late. Investigators pored over the transcripts, listening for anomalies in the minutes before the cut. The first officer's call-outs were precise, confirming altitudes and headings. The cockpit was performing exactly as expected until it wasn't. Some suggested equipment failure. Radios of the era, built on analog circuitry, were prone to interference. A blown fuse, a damaged antenna, or a malfunctioning transmitter could silence a cockpit. But even in such cases, backup systems existed. Most aircraft carried dual radios, and both would need to fail simultaneously for silence to be total. The odds of such a double failure, at the exact moment radar contact was lost, strained credibility. Others wondered if the crew had been incapacitated suddenly by smoke, decompression, or even a catastrophic breakup of the aircraft. Smoke in the cockpit usually triggers frantic transmissions. Decompression causes rushed calls, voices distorted by oxygen masks. A breakup produces chaotic bursts before the line dies. The quiet here was too complete, too sudden. The families who later read the transcripts were struck by the banality of the last words. No farewell, no warning, only a clipped acknowledgement that led nowhere. One widow remarked in an interview years later, "It's not just that he vanished, it's that he sounded so normal right before." When, decades later, a voice resurfaced on frequencies in 2004, investigators compared it directly with the 1971 tapes. The timbre, the phrasing, even the habit of pausing before acknowledging instructions, all were consistent with the original crew. For those who believed, it was proof that the silence had not been final, only delayed. Skeptics countered that radio logs are vulnerable to human error. A misheard call, a misfiled transcript, or a gap in recording could explain the abrupt ending. But skeptics could not explain why no further transmissions were heard by other aircraft, nor why no debris ever confirmed the disaster that silence implied. In the world of aviation, silence is not neutral. It is the absence of life, the collapse of systems, the breaking of routines. But in this case, the silence was something else entirely too clean, too sudden, and too complete. It was a silence that did not just suggest loss, it hinted at interruption, and when the long-delayed voice emerged more than 30 years later, the question grew darker. Had the silence been the end of the flight, or only a pause in a journey that defied time itself? 9. Time slips in folklore and aviation. The 1971 disappearance gained an eerie echo when placed against older maritime and aviation accounts. From sailors describing dead calms to pilots flying into walls of cloud, the language repeats across centuries. Could the vanished flight have stumbled into one of these zones where time itself falters? Stories of time slips stretch back far before powered flight. In the age of sail, mariners wrote of stretches of ocean where wind ceased, compasses spun, and days seemed to stretch unnaturally long. Logs from the 18th and 19th centuries describe dead calms in the Sargasso Sea, where crews felt trapped, not only in still waters but in distorted hours, nights that lingered, dawns that came too quickly, or stars that appeared out of place. For sailors who lived by celestial navigation, even small anomalies carried ominous weight. As aviation emerged in the early 20th century, these descriptions found new life in the skies. Pilots reported walls of cloud that appeared suddenly, stretching from ocean to horizon. Entering them brought moments of disorientation, instruments spinning, radio static rising, horizons tilting. In most cases, pilots emerged shaken but safe. Yet the language they used, otherworldly, unnatural, timeless, suggested that something more than weather was at work. One of the most famous accounts came from Flight 19 Inches 1945, a squadron of US Navy bombers that vanished during a training exercise. Their transmissions, recorded in real time, described compasses failing and seas that looked strange. The last words of their leader, Lieutenant Charles Taylor, hinted not at panic but confusion, an uncertainty about where, or even when, they were. No wreckage was ever found. Civilian aviators have echoed these accounts. In the 1,960 seconds, a British pilot flying over the English Channel reported entering a dense cloud bank and emerging to find his instruments inexplicably rewound, showing a loss of nearly 10 minutes. He landed safely, but his logbook recorded a discrepancy no one could explain. Others have described emerging from storms to find themselves hundreds of miles off course, with fuel consumption inconsistent with their flight time. Folklore has often framed these experiences as time slips moments, when the fabric of time bends, allowing travellers to step outside ordinary chronology. In Liverpool's Bold Street district, pedestrians in the 1,990 seconds reported walking into scenes from the 1,950 seconds, complete with shops and vehicles from another era, before just as suddenly returning to the present. The parallels with aviation accounts are striking. Abrupt shifts, vivid sensory immersion, and the complete lack of transition between one time and another. Skeptics point to psychology. Under stress, human perception can distort, turning minutes into hours or vice versa. In aviation, fatigue and disorientation may create the illusion of lost time, but these explanations falter when applied to groups multiple witnesses reporting the same phenomenon across decades, cultures, and technologies. The repetition of details, spinning compasses, static-filled radios, the sudden stillness of the air suggests a pattern that resists dismissal. For the 1,971 flight, this context is chilling. The calm skies of that day fit the pattern too well. Conditions so ordinary they mask the extraordinary. The abrupt silence, the absence of wreckage, the voice that returned decades later, each could be read as evidence of a time slip, a step into one of those strange corridors described by sailors and pilots alike. Whether such zones are natural anomalies, electromagnetic disturbances, or something beyond our science remains an open question. But history offers a troubling chorus of testimonies. Travellers lost not to distance, but to time itself. And if the vanished flight did stumble into such a corridor, its fate may not have been destruction at all, but displacement into a time not its own. The first recorded intercept in 2004 came on a frequency long used for civil aviation. Controllers noted the call sign, cross-checked it against databases, and found it belonged to an airline dissolved in the late 1,970 seconds. Yet the signal was strong, the cadence unmistakable. A professional pilot reporting position as if decades had not passed. At first, the intercept seemed like a curiosity. Controllers assumed a misread transmission, or perhaps a prankster testing vintage equipment. But as the message continued, the details grew impossible to dismiss. The pilot gave his aircraft's position, altitude, and heading with the clipped precision of someone trained in an earlier era. His references matched navigation points that had been retired decades earlier, removed from official charts when the airline ceased operations. The voice itself carried authority. Calm, unhurried, every word delivered in the measured rhythm of cockpit professionalism. Those who heard it remarked on its clarity, noting the slight hum of engines in the background and the faint clicks of analog instruments. These were details few hoaxers could replicate, especially in real time. Controllers attempted to respond. They instructed the aircraft to identify itself, to confirm fuel status, to clarify intentions. There was no acknowledgement. The voice continued as if speaking into the air of 1,971, unaware that the world had changed. After less than 2 minutes, the signal began to fade, dissolving into static. The final words were clipped mid-sentence, leaving silence in their place. The recording was replayed immediately. Engineers confirmed the transmission was not a rebroadcast from archival tape. The signal characteristics pointed to a live broadcast. Its strength indicated it originated from the open sky, not from a ground station. Triangulation narrowed the source to an empty corridor of airspace over the ocean, a sector with no registered flights at the time. Investigators compared the voice to archived training tapes of the missing crew. The similarities were uncanny. The phrasing, the slight pause before acknowledgements, even the intonation of certain numbers all matched. One expert, after analysing the audio spectrograph, concluded, "If this is not the same pilot, it is someone trained in exactly the same environment, speaking with the same habits frozen in time." For families of the lost, the news was both devastating and electrifying. Some dismissed it as coincidence, unwilling to reopen old wounds. Others clung to the idea that their loved ones had survived in some impossible way. A widow told reporters, "I heard his voice once on a tape in 1971, and I heard it again in 2004. I know it was him." Official agencies reacted cautiously. The intercept was logged, the tape archived, but public statements referred only to unusual interference. Aviation authorities avoided speculation, unwilling to validate the growing whispers of a flight returning from another time. Yet within closed circles, the tapes circulated among analysts and engineers who could not explain it away. Skeptics argued it was a hoax, yet the sophistication required to replicate period-specific radio equipment, voice cadence, and navigational references seemed beyond ordinary mischief. Others suggested atmospheric lensing, a rare phenomenon where old signals bounce through layers of the ionosphere, replaying fragments decades later. But such echoes usually degrade into noise. This transmission had been crisp, controlled, alive. For those who listened, the most haunting detail was not the data reported, but the tone itself. The pilot did not sound lost, distressed, or even aware of anything unusual. He sounded exactly as he had in 1971, steady, professional, convinced that he was on an ordinary flight path, and that calmness, across 33 years of silence, was perhaps the most chilling evidence of all. Those who replayed the recording later noted background hums no longer heard in modern cockpits, the faint whine of analog instruments, the click of dials. Even the phrasing was archaic, in the clipped professional style of Cold War-era aviation. This was not a reenactment, it was a voice anchored in its own time. To audio engineers, the recording was a trove of small details that spoke louder than the words themselves. Modern cockpits are nearly silent environments, dominated by digital displays and electronic tones. But the tape from 2004 carried a constant undercurrent. The mechanical hum of gyroscopes, the soft crackle of vacuum-driven instruments, and the metallic clink of switches being adjusted. These sounds were signatures of a cockpit from the 1960 seconds and early 70 seconds, when aviation was still ruled by analog machines. The phrasing of the pilot reinforced this sense of another era. He used call-outs no longer standard, requesting Sector 4 confirmation and reporting fuel in pounds rather than kilograms. His cadence was slow but precise, reflecting Cold War-era training that prized clarity over speed. Linguists who examined the tape even noted a shift in accent, a slight mid-Atlantic inflection, common in professional speech of the time but rarely heard by the 21st century. Each layer of detail deepened the mystery. If this had been a hoax, it would have required extraordinary preparation, not only sourcing period-accurate radio equipment, but reproducing the sonic fingerprint of an analog cockpit in motion. The hum of instruments is not something easily faked. It varies with power settings, altitude, and vibration. To replicate it convincingly would require either a functioning vintage aircraft or access to recordings that, as far as archivists know, do not exist. Investigators replayed the tape dozens of times, isolating frequencies, measuring harmonics. They identified the steady drone of turbojet engines lower in pitch and rougher in tone than the high-bypass turbofans used in modern airliners. The spectral analysis matched closely to aircraft models phased out of service by the mid-1980 seconds. It was as if the recording had captured not only a voice but the very machinery of a vanished fleet. Even the static itself carried meaning. In modern systems, static tends to spike in bursts, filtered by advanced radios. But this transmission had the long, rolling hiss of older HF signals, the kind pilots in the 1,970 seconds struggled against when crossing oceans. That auditory texture alone marked the voice as belonging to another age. Some engineers speculated that the transmission was not a hoax, but a time echo, an audio imprint somehow carried across decades by atmospheric conditions. Rare phenomena in the ionosphere have been known to reflect signals beyond normal limits, but the clarity and structure of this message troubled even the most cautious scientists. Unlike echoes, which degrade, this signal was coherent, alive, and unmistakably in the present moment of its broadcast. For families who listened, the technical arguments mattered less than the emotional impact. Hearing the voice of a loved one preserved in static was like opening a time capsule sealed against their will. One daughter of a missing passenger described the hum of the engines in the background as the sound of my childhood. It felt like he was still out there, mid-flight. What the tape proved or failed to prove remains debated, but in its textures, its hums, its static, it carried something profound. Not just the sound of a pilot, but the atmosphere of an era long past, bleeding through into the modern age. And in that uncanny layering of voices and machines, listeners could not help but wonder, was it really an echo? Or was it the momentary presence of a plane still flying, trapped in a corridor of time that had not yet released it? The 2004 broadcast lasted barely 90 seconds. Controllers attempted response, but no acknowledgement came. The voice recited headings, a fuel estimate, and then broke into distortion. The final phrase, half swallowed by static, mentioned clear skies and holding steady. Then silence reclaimed the frequency. For investigators, the brevity of the call was its most haunting feature. The pilot spoke as though he were in routine communication, unaware that the world on the other end was separated by 3 decades of history. His message contained details so precise: altitude, airspeed, fuel state, that it read like a log entry frozen in time. Recordings of the intercept reveal a chilling progression. The first 30 seconds are crisp, the voice strong and steady. Then, faint distortion begins to creep in, as though the transmission were moving farther away. At the 1-minute mark, the static thickens, warping vowels and clipping consonants. The final 30 seconds are a struggle, with fragments emerging through the hiss. Clear skies, holding steady. Then, abruptly, silence. The channel cleared as if nothing had ever passed through it. Engineers analysed the fade carefully. In ordinary conditions, a weak signal tapers gradually, slipping into background noise. But this broadcast ended differently, sharp, almost surgical, as if the connection itself had been cut. No squelch, no trailing carrier wave, just absence. That anomaly suggested the broadcast hadn't drifted away, but had been severed. Attempts to reach the pilot went unanswered. Controllers repeated the call sign, cycling through alternate frequencies, even reverting to emergency channels. No reply came. Radar operators scanned the corridor identified in the message, yet no aircraft appeared. The skies were empty, but the radio had told a different story. The specificity of the pilot's words troubled experts most. His fuel estimate was given in pounds, not kilograms, consistent with procedures of 1,971. His headings referenced waypoints that had been removed from charts decades earlier. Even his report of clear skies matched the meteorological record for that patch of ocean on the day of the transmission. Whoever was speaking believed with complete conviction that they were mid-flight, still on schedule, still within the framework of their own time. For families who listened, the cutoff was devastating. The message suggested continuity, that for at least those 90 seconds, the crew and passengers were alive, speaking into the air. Then, just as suddenly, they were gone again. One widow remarked, "It was like hearing him breathe for a moment, only to lose him all over again." Skeptics argued the abrupt end supported the idea of a hoax. A fabricated signal might simply shut off when the operator chose, but skeptics struggled to explain the depth of technical detail embedded in the message, or the uncanny alignment of phrasing with the lost crew's known habits. To believers, the 90-second call felt like a window that had opened briefly, offering a glimpse of a world suspended in mid-flight. The silence that followed was not just absence, it was the closing of that window, as if the corridor between times had sealed shut. In aviation, cut transmissions are usually warnings of catastrophe, power loss, fire, sudden decompression. But here, the calmness of the words made the ending more disturbing. The pilot had not been shouting or panicked. He was reporting steady progress. And then, mid-sentence, he was erased. The tape ends where it began in silence. Yet that silence carries weight, not as an ending, but as a reminder that the story was interrupted, not concluded. 90 seconds of clarity, followed by a void that still stretches forward. Technical teams backtracked the radio intercept, triangulating through civilian and military stations. The result defied logic. The signal originated from a point over open sea, in a corridor where no registered aircraft was flying. The air was empty, yet a ghost had spoken. The process of triangulation is methodical. Signals are captured by multiple listening posts, their strength and timing compared to calculate a point of origin. In 2004, this system was advanced enough to track everything from passenger jets to small fishing vessels carrying radios. When the mysterious broadcast came through, engineers expected to locate a conventional aircraft. Instead, the coordinates pointed to a stretch of ocean hundreds of miles from any known traffic lanes. At the time of the intercept, no scheduled flights were recorded in that airspace. Commercial routes had shifted decades earlier, leaving the corridor unused. Military logs confirmed that no exercises were underway, no patrols deployed, no aircraft authorized to fly in the area. Controllers double-checked international databases. The skies were officially empty, yet the voice had come from there, clear and strong. Analysts considered atmospheric anomalies. Under certain conditions, high-frequency radio waves can bend along the ionosphere, creating the illusion of signals arriving from impossible directions. But the triangulation did not scatter, it converged with precision, narrowing the source to a circle less than 20 miles wide. If this was an atmospheric trick, it was one with uncanny focus. Search efforts were discreet. A reconnaissance plane was dispatched to sweep the coordinates. Pilots reported pristine skies, unbroken sea, and no sign of aircraft. Satellite imaging reviewed after the fact showed nothing unusual, no contrails, no radar signatures, no thermal traces. The ocean lay silent, indifferent. The absence of evidence unsettled investigators. A signal of that strength required power consistent with a functioning aircraft transmitter. Such systems are designed to broadcast across hundreds of miles, but they cannot operate without engines running or electrical systems alive. If the vanished jet had truly been the source, it suggested not wreckage on the seafloor, but a plane still airborne, decades after it had been declared lost. Engineers replayed the intercept, studying its technical fingerprint. The modulation was consistent with 1970 seconds era radios, operating on frequencies no longer standard in 2004. Even the fade pattern matched older transmitters. It was as if a fragment of obsolete technology had reappeared in the spectrum, carrying with it the voice of a crew long presumed dead. For families of the missing, the news was another cruel twist. Some took solace in the idea that their loved ones had not perished, but had continued their journey elsewhere, their voices breaking through only briefly. Others saw it as torment proof of life too fleeting to grasp. One brother of a lost passenger said, "It's worse than silence. Silence you can bury." But this was like they were calling from a place we can't reach. Official reports framed the event as an unresolved anomaly. Internal memos warned against speculation, but behind closed doors, theories abounded. Was the signal a sophisticated hoax? A classified military test misinterpreted? Or had a plane truly crossed back into our skies from another time? None of the answers fit neatly. In the end, the triangulation stood as one of the strangest elements of the case. The signal had a point of origin, fixed and real, yet the sky above it was empty. It was a paradox written into the mathematics of radio waves, proof of presence in a place where nothing was, and in that contradiction, investigators glimpsed the heart of the mystery. A voice that should not have existed, mapped to a sky that had no plane to give it form. News of the intercept reached surviving relatives of passengers listed missing since 1971. Some dismissed it as cruel trickery. Others wept at the idea their loved ones might still exist, somewhere. One daughter, now in her 50s, told reporters, "It was his voice. I know it." The news travelled quietly at first, whispered among investigators and journalists who had followed the case for decades. Then it reached living rooms and kitchens, where families of the missing had long since packed away photographs and folded grief into the corners of their lives. For some, the intercept reawakened hope they had carefully buried. For others, it felt like reopening a wound that had never truly healed. In interviews, reactions varied sharply. A son who had been a child in 1971 said he refused to believe the story. "I don't want my mother's last years disturbed by false hope." Yet another relative, holding a copy of the transcript, claimed he recognized his father's phrasing, an unusual way of reading out fuel totals. The specificity was too convincing to ignore. For many, hearing that a recording existed was both a comfort and a torment. Comfort because the voices seemed preserved, suggesting the passengers had not perished in chaos. Torment because the glimpse was fleeting, gone in less than 2 minutes, offering no resolution. Families had already endured decades of silence. To be given only a fragment of sound was almost cruel. Psychologists who worked with survivors' relatives noted the unique strain of ambiguous loss, a grief without closure, where the boundary between life and death is uncertain. The intercept deepened this condition. It suggested presence without return, life without reunion. Some family members dreamed vividly of arrivals that never came, of phones ringing in the night with voices carried forward from the past. The media seized on the human drama. Headlines spoke of ghost calls and voices from the lost flight. Some relatives welcomed the attention, using interviews to keep their loved ones' names alive. Others recoiled, fearing exploitation. A widow said quietly, "For years, no one asked us anything. Now they ask too much." Behind the public spectacle, there were private moments of reckoning. Old suitcases were opened, photographs taken down from attics, letters reread until the paper thinned. For a daughter who had been 8 years old when her father vanished, the intercept meant she heard his voice again, not as memory, but as presence. The way he paused before numbers that was him. Nobody else did that. Nobody else could. Authorities attempted to temper expectations. Official statements described the intercept as unverified and possibly interference. But the careful language only fueled suspicion. Why, families asked, would agencies so quickly minimize an event that seemed to hold the very evidence they had begged for? Some believed the truth was being withheld. Others feared the silence of officials meant they too were unsettled by what they could not explain. Community gatherings were held, bringing together relatives who had drifted apart since the early 1970s. They shared fragments, dreams, doubts, and stories of who the passengers had been. For many, the intercept was not only about mystery, but about memory. It was a reminder that 33 years had passed. Yet the people aboard that flight remained frozen in time, neither aging nor returning. The voice on the tape offered no answers. It gave only a presence, steady, professional, unaware of the decades lost. For the families who listened, it was both unbearable and unforgettable. Because in those 90 seconds, their loved ones were alive again, just long enough to vanish once more. Descriptions matched a twin jetliner model common in the early 1970 seconds. But in 2004, not a single one remained in commercial service in that livery. Aviation historians confirmed the airline ceased operations in 1979. To hear its call sign alive again was like hearing a telegram from the dead. The aircraft most frequently associated with the intercept was a narrow-body twin jet, widely used on short and medium-haul routes in the late 1960 seconds and early 70 seconds. At its peak, hundreds of these planes crisscrossed North America daily, hauling business travelers, holidaymakers, and cargo with steady reliability. By the early 1980 seconds, however, they were being phased out, replaced by more fuel-efficient designs. By 2004, None were left in active passenger fleets in that original paint scheme, yet the radio intercept contained unmistakable references to this very model. Even the cadence of their checklist mirrored the operational manuals of that aircraft type. For engineers who reviewed the transcript, the conclusion was inescapable. Historians confirmed that the airline tied to the call sign no longer existed. Its final routes were absorbed by larger carriers after it dissolved in 1979. The livery, a bold stripe in the colours of the era, hadn't been seen on tarmacs in decades. Aviation enthusiasts, meticulous in their record-keeping, agreed. No surviving aircraft bore that registration, not in storage, not in museums, not in scrapyards. To hear its call sign broadcast anew was to hear a voice from an airline erased from the skies. The implications unsettled experts. Was this evidence of a deliberate impersonation, a hoaxer resurrecting an obsolete identity? If so, the impersonator had achieved uncanny accuracy. Even minor details, the reporting of fuel in pounds, the use of now obsolete navigation points, would have required access to manuals and training materials unavailable to the public. Some speculated that perhaps an old airframe had survived in secret, operated illegally, or preserved in private hands. But even this theory collapsed under scrutiny. Aircraft maintenance requires extensive support. Spare parts, inspections, certification. To keep such a jet operational into 2004 without detection would have been nearly impossible. No logbooks, no photographs, no registrations supported the idea. Instead, the anomaly grew sharper. The description matched something that no longer existed. The plane was real in 1971. It was real in the voices of the crew. But in 2004, it was a phantom. A technical impossibility given form only in radio waves. Families of the missing clung to the possibility that the aircraft had not been destroyed but displaced. Perhaps, they suggested, it continued flying in a corridor beyond ordinary time, only occasionally brushing against our world. To them, the lack of wreckage was consistent with this eerie survival. Aviation historians, though cautious, admitted the call sign's reappearance was unprecedented. Planes are retired, scrapped, or displayed, one noted. They don't just return to service 30 years later by accident. The ghost of the aircraft hovered in the conversation long after the intercept ended. In archives, its name remains crossed out, grounded forever in official registries. But in that 90-second broadcast, it flew again, its engines humming, its crew reporting calmly, as if no years had passed at all. And in that impossible alignment, the call sign of a defunct airline carried on the voice of a vanished jet. Listeners found themselves confronting a chilling question. Had history itself been interrupted, or had a plane long erased from records simply refused to stay gone? Skeptics argued the intercept was the work of a skilled hoaxer with access to old radio equipment. But radio experts countered that the signal strength, transmission style, and fading patterns fit long-range airborne broadcast, not ground trickery. The skeptical explanation emerged almost immediately after news of the transmission spread. A hoax was simpler, cleaner, more consistent with the principle that extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence. With access to vintage radios and aviation manuals, some believed an enthusiast or a prankster could have reconstructed the illusion. Radio collectors confirmed that period-accurate equipment was not impossible to find. Swap meets, online forums, and private estates sometimes yielded transmitters dating back to the 1,000, 960 seconds and 70 seconds. With technical knowledge, a determined individual could restore one to working order. Coupled with recordings of old cockpit chatter, skeptics argued a convincing reenactment might be produced. But experts in radio propagation noted that the intercept bore characteristics not easily faked. The signal had strength consistent with high-altitude transmission, carrying cleanly across hundreds of miles before fading into static. Ground-based hoaxes typically betray themselves through uneven power levels, interference patterns, or proximity signatures. Here, the fade resembled an aircraft moving through space, not a fixed station. The voice itself posed further challenges. Audio analysis revealed not only phrasing and tone consistent with 1,970 seconds cockpit discipline, but also the subtle mechanical backdrop of a functioning analog cockpit. The hum of engines, the faint whir of gyroscopic instruments, and the click of switches aligned perfectly with what one would expect inside a jet of that era. You would need not just the voice, one engineer observed, but the entire acoustic environment. That is not something you can replicate with a tape recorder in a garage. The skeptics countered with psychological explanations. The families, they argued, were predisposed to hear familiarity in any recording. A stranger's voice, shaped by static, might be mistaken for a loved one after decades of longing. Confirmation bias could do the rest, but this argument faltered when faced with the technical experts who also verified the audio's period accuracy. Others suggested military involvement. Perhaps, they theorized, the intercept was the accidental bleed-through of a classified exercise, using legacy equipment to test signal durability. Governments rarely confirm or deny such programs, leaving fertile ground for speculation. Yet even military analysts admitted that the use of an obsolete airline call sign would have been an odd, even reckless choice. The debate widened as academics joined in. Linguists examined the cadence, noting archaic terms no longer taught in aviation schools. Psychologists analyzed the reactions of families, weighing the impact of ambiguous evidence on long-term grief. Engineers scrutinized the harmonics, searching for flaws. Each discipline brought its skepticism, but none produced a definitive debunking. To the public, the clash of voices left the case suspended between belief and doubt. For every argument that the intercept was a trick, there was a counterpoint pointing to its authenticity. If it was a hoax, one controller remarked, then it was the most convincing hoax I've ever heard. In the end, the skeptics achieved only partial ground. They cast shadows of doubt but could not erase the details, the fading signal, the obsolete terminology, the mechanical hum of an aircraft type no longer flying. The mystery remained intact, resilient against dismissal, and so the question lingered. If skepticism could not fully explain the voice, did that mean belief had to take its place? Or was the truth hovering in the space between, waiting for another transmission to tip the balance? The area where the transmission was traced coincides with a known zone of geomagnetic irregularities, where compasses spin and instruments occasionally fail. Could the flight have slipped into such a pocket not just spatially, but temporally? Mariners and aviators have long noted strange behavior in this stretch of sea and sky. Compass needles wander without warning, sometimes rotating slowly, other times spinning with disorienting speed. Radios experience bursts of static, even on clear days. Aircraft crossing the region have reported momentary glitches, altimeters freezing, heading indicators reversing, or navigation systems drifting off course before suddenly correcting themselves. Scientists attribute much of this activity to natural geomagnetic anomalies. The Earth's magnetic field is not uniform. It is shaped by mineral deposits in the crust, by tectonic boundaries, and by flows within the planet's molten core. In certain regions, these forces converge, creating zones where magnetic north seems to wobble. Pilots are trained to compensate, but the effects can still unsettle even seasoned crews. In the area tied to the 2004 transmission, charts dating back to the 1,950 seconds carry warnings for navigators. Magnetic deviation, use caution. Naval patrols logged repeated episodes of unreliable readings, particularly during solar storms. Submariners, too, described sonar behaving unpredictably, as though echoes were being bent by invisible currents. Such anomalies were well documented, though rarely considered dangerous, but some researchers began to wonder if these irregularities extended beyond the physical. Could the same electromagnetic turbulence that scrambled instruments also interfere with time itself? The idea sounds speculative, but in fringe physics, proposals exist that fluctuations in strong fields might distort the perception of time, or even the rate at which time flows locally. A handful of cases feed this speculation. In 1969, a private pilot reported losing 10 minutes while flying over a nearby sector, his wristwatch and cockpit clock disagreeing with official records upon landing. In the 1,980 seconds, a fishing trawler crew claimed they experienced a night that seemed impossibly short, the stars shifting overhead faster than expected. While conventional explanations, instrument error, fatigue, memory distortion can account for such reports, the similarities form a troubling pattern. The 1,971 disappearance seemed to align too closely with these anomalies. A perfectly clear day, a professional crew, and then, without warning, silence. If electromagnetic interference played a role, it may not have been limited to compasses and radios. It may have enveloped the entire aircraft in conditions our science has not yet mapped. When the voice returned in 2004, analysts noted faint distortions in the transmission, ripples in the signal not typical of ordinary radio fade. Some speculated that these distortions hinted at passage through a medium unstable in both space and time. To skeptics, this was little more than the layering of mystery upon mystery, but to believers, it was the missing piece. The aircraft had not crashed, but slipped into an electromagnetic pocket, suspended until conditions released it briefly back into our world. Governments have occasionally acknowledged the strangeness of such zones. Declassified documents from the Cold War reference areas of magnetic unreliability where both aircraft and submarines required extra caution. Yet no official report has ever suggested a temporal dimension to the problem. That part remains confined to speculation, a place where science and folklore overlap uneasily. Still, the coincidence lingers. The last known position of the vanished flight and the triangulated source of the 2004 transmission both fall within this same region of geomagnetic turbulence. Two anomalies, separated by decades, united by geography. Perhaps it was nothing more than interference, or perhaps, as some quietly suggest, it was the edge of something larger. A boundary where space, magnetism, and time weave together in ways we are only beginning to imagine. Some physicists suggest rare upper atmospheric conditions can bend signals, carrying voices across decades-old recordings or rebroadcasts. But this fails to explain why the 2004 signal contained live, contemporary phrasing, as if the pilot were still waiting for landing clearance. The atmosphere is not a static shell, but a living, shifting medium. Layers of ionized particles in the ionosphere bend and scatter radio transmissions, sometimes carrying them hundreds or even thousands of miles beyond their intended range. Amateur radio operators have long documented such events, catching stray signals from continents away, bouncing off invisible layers of charged air. These phenomena are rare, but not unheard of. Proponents of atmospheric lensing argue that the 2004 intercept may have been one such event, a rebroadcast of a transmission made in 1971, carried forward by unusual conditions. In this view, the pilot's words were not alive in the present, but echoes, refracted and delayed, until they finally found their way back to Earth. On the surface, this explanation offers comfort. It grounds the mystery in natural science without invoking time slips or vanished aircraft. Yet closer inspection raises difficult questions. For one, rebroadcasted signals degrade. They lose clarity, breaking into fragments drowned by static. But the 2004 intercept was coherent, steady, and unmistakably structured. Every phrase fit together as if spoken in real time, not like a broken record of the past. Then there was the phrasing itself. The pilot did not repeat details frozen in 1971. He gave a fuel estimate that aligned with his supposed flight stage. He acknowledged headings as though in mid-course adjustment. And his final phrase, holding steady, carried the inflection of someone responding in the moment, not a line trapped in archival tape. Physicists examining the tape admitted as much. If this were an echo, one researcher noted, it is the most coherent echo ever documented. It behaves like a live transmission, not a relic. The theory faltered under the weight of its own improbability. To carry a signal for 33 years without degradation, across a shifting planet, and have it arrive intact was beyond any known model of atmospheric propagation. Still, skeptics leaned on it, preferring an improbable physics anomaly to the unsettling alternative that a pilot long missing had spoken again. They pointed to smaller precedents, ships' radios replaying fragments of old distress calls, or aircraft receiving faint snippets of long-past conversations. None matched the scale of the 2004 event, but they suggested the atmosphere could play tricks. Others noted that atmospheric lensing cannot create what was not there. If the broadcast was truly contemporary in detail, then the pilot's voice had to be speaking in that moment, not echoing from the past. The lensing theory explained how a signal might travel strangely, but not why the content matched the living conditions of a flight presumed lost. For families, the distinction mattered little. An echo still meant the words had once been spoken. A live voice meant their loved ones were still, impossibly, speaking. Either way, the sound reopened grief. One daughter asked, "If it was just a reflection, why did it feel like he was waiting for us to answer?" In the end, atmospheric lensing remained a theory of convenience grounded in real science, but stretched beyond what evidence could support. It explained the carrier, perhaps, but not the message. And in the gap between science and mystery, the voice of 2004 lingered, as clear as it was impossible. Reports from the Bermuda Triangle, in the 1,940 seconds and 50 seconds, describe eerily similar radio last words. Compasses gone crazy. Ocean looks strange. Everything wrong. The 1,971 2004 case slots into this lineage. A chorus of voices struggling against something unseen. The Bermuda Triangle, bounded loosely by Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico, has long been infamous for vanishings at sea and in the air. In the 1,940 seconds, naval patrols and cargo planes reported compass malfunctions and inexplicable weather changes in skies otherwise clear. By the 1,950 seconds, the triangle had become shorthand for the unknown, a region where machines faltered and human voices faded mid-sentence. The most well-known case remains Flight 19, a squadron of 5 Navy bombers that disappeared in December 1945. Their transmissions are chilling in their ordinariness. "We can't tell where we are. Compasses gone crazy. The ocean looks strange." The squadron leader sounded confused but not panicked, reporting contradictions that no training could explain. Other accounts followed. In 1948, a Douglas DC-3 vanished en route from San Juan to Miami with 29 people aboard. The pilot's final transmission was calm, reporting position and altitude. Minutes later, contact ended abruptly. Despite extensive searches, no trace was recovered. In 1954, a military transport reported instruments not responding before radar contact was lost. These transmissions, scattered across years, shared a disturbing pattern. Calm voices cut short, equipment failing without cause, skies described as both clear and strange. By the late 20th century, the Bermuda Triangle had become mythologized fuel for books, television specials, and folklore. Scientists argued that currents, storms, and human error explained much of the mystery, but for those who studied the original transcripts, the details were harder to dismiss. Pilots did not describe storms, they described disorientation. Mariners did not speak of wreckage, they spoke of oceans that seemed unnatural. It was the language of perception itself, unraveling. The 1,971 disappearance, later tied to the 2004 intercept, seemed to echo this tradition. A calm crew, ideal weather, no distress signal, and then silence. When the voice resurfaced decades later, still calm, still reporting routine details, it mirrored the strangeness of the Bermuda account's voices speaking across a divide, unaware of the abyss beneath their words. Some researchers argue that the triangle and the 1,971 case may share a common mechanism. Electromagnetic disturbances, perhaps, or atmospheric lenses bending both light and radio. Others step further, suggesting windows in time or space localized anomalies, where navigation, communication, and chronology itself falter. Such ideas remain speculative, but the parallels between cases give them weight. Skeptics remind us that disappearances occur worldwide, not just within the triangle. Planes vanish in mountains, ships founder in storms. What makes the triangle stand out, they argue, is narrative, a clustering of stories told and retold until myth hardens into mystery. Yet even skeptics acknowledge that the repetition of eerily similar last words across decades demands explanation. For families of the 1,971 passengers, the Bermuda Triangle stories were both haunting and familiar. Like the widows of Flight 19, they lived with transcripts that ended too soon, voices that described clarity before fading into silence. The shared lineage of language compasses spinning, skies shifting, calm voices cut short connected them to a broader history of grief and unanswered questions. In the end, the Bermuda Triangle remains less a place than a symbol. a reminder that even in the age of radar, satellites, and global tracking, there are still pockets where machines fail and voices vanish. The 1971-2004 case joined this lineage, not as myth but as modern testimony, a reminder that the echoes of the triangle are not confined to the past. Audio analysts identified a low-frequency hum consistent with turbojet engines phased out by the mid-1980 seconds. Modern aircraft no longer make that sound. It was as though the machine itself, not just the pilot, had spoken across decades. When the 2004 intercept was replayed in laboratories, engineers filtered the voice to isolate the background. Beneath the steady cadence of the pilot, a distinct resonance emerged. The throaty, almost mechanical drone of early-generation turbojets. These engines were the backbone of commercial aviation in the 1960 seconds and early 70 seconds, but by the 1980 seconds they had been replaced by quieter, more efficient turbofans. By the 21st century, their sound was virtually extinct. To those trained in acoustics, the distinction was unmistakable. Turbojets produced a harsher, more metallic timbre, their narrow bypass design funneling thrust in a way that created deep vibrations. In contrast, turbofans of modern fleets generate a smoother, subdued tone. The intercept carried none of that softness. Instead, it echoed with the unmistakable growl of an engine type no longer in the skies. The realization unsettled investigators. If the intercept were a hoax, why replicate not just the pilot's voice, but the soundscape of a vanished machine? To mimic the harmonic profile of a 1970 seconds, turbojet would require either a functioning aircraft or access to archival cockpit recordings of extraordinary quality recordings that few believed existed. Spectrographic analysis confirmed the anomaly. Engineers plotted the frequencies of the background hum and compared them against known signatures. The result matched archived profiles of the JT-8D turbojet, once standard on aircraft like the DC-9 and early 727 seconds. The match was not approximate, it was exact, down to the frequency bands generated at cruise thrust. The finding deepened the mystery. Aircraft equipped with those engines had long since been retired or scrapped. Museums preserved a handful in static display, but none remained operational in passenger service. The 2004 signal, however, carried the living voice of those machines, as if one had continued flying, unseen, through the years. For families of the missing, the hum was more than technical data. It was memory. Many recalled boarding those flights in their youth. The roar of engines so loud it rattled windows and vibrated through the cabin floor. To hear it again was to be transported backward, to the very era their loved ones had vanished. One daughter described it as the sound of my father's last journey, still alive in the air. Skeptics again suggested alternative explanations. Could the hum have been an artifact of recording equipment? Could interference or background noise have mimicked the profile of a long-retired engine? Analysts dismissed these ideas. The frequency distribution was too precise, too aligned with the thrust harmonics of the turbojet. Static produces randomness. This sound carried order. Some researchers wondered if the engines themselves were part of the message, not just incidental background, but evidence that the aircraft had truly returned. It wasn't only the voice that came back, one engineer observed. It was the machine. The signal carried both. The hum raised deeper questions still. If the engines had indeed continued running beyond their known lifespans, what maintained them? What conditions preserved fuel, oil, and machinery for more than 30 years? Unless, as some whispered, the aircraft had not endured those decades at all but stepped over them entirely. In the end, the sound of the engines was more than technical data, it was testimony. The drone of a machine that should no longer exist, speaking in harmonics no modern plane could produce. Together with the pilot's calm voice, it formed a duet across time. Man and machine, holding steady, as if 1971 had never ended. In ordinary crashes, wreckage floats, washes ashore, or is dredged up by trawlers. None of the 1971 flight's remains were ever discovered. It was as though the plane had left our world entire. Aviation history shows that even the most violent disasters leave something behind. Seat cushions, buoyed by air pockets, drift for days. Oil slicks mark the sea where engines broke apart. Aluminum fragments scatter across beaches. But in the case of the vanished 1971 flight, nothing surfaced. The sea remained unbroken, the shorelines barren, the trawlers empty-handed. In the first weeks after the disappearance, naval craft combed thousands of square miles, dragging sonar equipment to scan the depths. Divers explored coastal shelves, while reconnaissance aircraft swept overhead with high-resolution cameras. The expectation was simple. Sooner or later, something no matter how small would emerge. Yet each report ended with the same words: negative findings. Investigators compared the case to past maritime and aviation disasters. In 1956, when two aircraft collided over the Grand Canyon, debris rained across miles of desert. In 1963, a passenger jet that went down off Japan left fields of wreckage visible for weeks. Even deep ocean accidents eventually yield fragments, rising through currents or dredged up by chance. But the 1971 disappearance provided nothing. No flotsam, no fuselage, not even a shred of life raft. Skeptics suggested strong currents may have scattered the wreckage far from the expected search zones. The ocean, vast and merciless, often conceals its secrets, yet this explanation faltered in light of precedent. Even with dispersal, some trace should have appeared along shipping lanes, washed up on remote beaches, or tangled in fishing nets. Decades later, when trawlers still hauled aluminum shards from forgotten crashes, the sea remained silent on this one. For families, the absence of debris was the most unbearable fact. Without wreckage, there could be no funerals, no graves, no closure. They were left with symbolic ceremonies and empty coffins. A widow later recalled standing at the shoreline for hours, watching the horizon, convinced that anything would float into view. Nothing ever did. Some researchers proposed alternative explanations. One theory suggested the aircraft may never have struck water at all, instead diverted far from its projected path into an unmapped region. Another entertained structural disintegration so complete that the wreckage sank rapidly, beyond the reach of 1,970 seconds technology. But neither theory could explain the total absence of floating debris in the critical first days. Others moved into speculative territory. If the aircraft had slipped into an electromagnetic or temporal anomaly, as some suggested, then no wreckage would remain because no crash had ever occurred. Instead, the plane might have continued elsewhere, out of sight, out of time. To believers, the silence of the sea was not evidence of destruction, but of displacement. Decades later, the contrast with other tragedies remained striking. When Air France Flight 447 crashed into the Atlantic in 2009, debris was located within days despite deep ocean challenges. When Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 vanished in 2014, fragments washed ashore across the Indian Ocean within 2 years. Against this backdrop, the 1,971 disappearance grew only stranger. In the end, the absence of wreckage became its own form of testimony, not proof of survival, nor certainty of loss, but a void that resisted every ordinary explanation. The missing flight did not leave behind fragments, clues, or closure. It left only silence and emptiness that investigators could neither measure nor resolve. And in that silence, a darker possibility lingered. Perhaps the reason no wreckage ever appeared was because the plane had never been destroyed at all. Some researchers probed airfield logs from the 1,970 seconds, searching for undocumented landings. A few reports mention unidentified aircraft touching down, their crews disoriented, asking the year, but such accounts vanish into rumour before confirmation. In aviation archives, whispers of unscheduled arrivals surface, occasionally planes appearing on runways unannounced, their call signs unrecognised, their crews confused. Most are written off as clerical errors or misfiled reports, but a handful stand out, aligning eerily with the time window after the 1971 disappearance. One story comes from a small Caribbean airfield, where tower personnel allegedly recorded a twin-engine jet arriving without clearance in 1973. The crew, speaking in professional cadence, reportedly asked for refueling but could not produce current documentation. They gave an airline name already dissolved, and when questioned further, abruptly taxied back onto the runway and departed. Official logs note only unknown aircraft departed, with no further trace. Another tale emerges from South America. In 1976, a regional controller claimed an aircraft requested approach clearance using outdated navigation terms. When questioned, the pilot hesitated before replying with coordinates decades out of use. The aircraft landed, stayed less than an hour, and then departed again, leaving behind no record in airline schedules or customs rosters. Witnesses later recalled the crew appeared confused, as though they did not recognize the world around them. Skeptics dismiss these stories as urban legends, fueled by the popularity of time-slip folklore. Indeed, many such accounts circulate in aviation culture, embroidered with details over time, but researchers point out that these rumors often cluster around the same period. The early to mid-1970 seconds, when the missing flight should have been at large if it had somehow survived. Attempts to verify the stories run into walls. Logs are missing, altered, or classified. Witnesses recant or pass away, leaving fragments of testimony that cannot be fully tested. Yet the persistence of these accounts keeps the possibility alive that the vanished plane did not disintegrate, but touched down, however briefly, in places that were unprepared to receive it. The implications are staggering. If the aircraft landed, even once, why did it not stay? Did the crew realize something was wrong, that the world had shifted beyond recognition? Were they unable or unwilling to remain in a time that was no longer theirs? Psychologists note the strangeness of such hypothetical encounters. A crew arriving years out of place would experience disorientation at every level. Unfamiliar uniforms, new equipment, altered language. Asking the year, as some accounts describe, would not be an idle question, but an urgent attempt to bridge a gap they could not explain. For families, the rumors offered both hope and anguish. Hope, because landing implied survival. Anguish, because survival without return was no resolution at all. If they lived long enough to land, one relative asked, why didn't they come home? The question lingers in the air like contrails visible, undeniable, but quickly scattered by wind. Aviation historians tread carefully around these stories. They remind us that airfields in the 1970 seconds were not as tightly monitored as today. Aircraft could occasionally arrive unannounced, especially in remote regions, without triggering the scrutiny that would follow now. But the repetition of details, the wrong call signs, the outdated terminology, the disoriented crews suggests something more than clerical error. Ultimately, the notion that the 1971 flight may have landed elsewhere remains unproven, suspended between rumor and possibility. Yet it deepens the mystery, forcing us to ask not just where the aircraft went, but where it might have been, briefly and impossibly, before vanishing once again into silence. One line of speculation: the jet slipped sideways into a parallel timeline. In that reality, passengers continued their journey unaware. Only once in 2004 did their voices brush our world, like a radio dial catching two stations at once. The idea of parallel universes has long hovered at the edge of science and philosophy. The multiverse theory, drawn from interpretations of quantum mechanics, suggests that reality may not be singular but layered. Every decision, every particle interaction could branch into alternate outcomes, producing worlds that run alongside ours, similar yet distinct, forever hidden from direct view. Applied to aviation mysteries, the hypothesis becomes unsettling. What if the 1971 flight did not crash, but shifted into one of these adjacent worlds? In that parallel stream of history, the crew and passengers may have landed safely, gone on with their lives, and never known they had slipped away from the world their families inhabited. For them, perhaps, nothing strange occurred. The strangeness belonged only to us, the observers left behind. The 2004 transmission is central to this speculation. Some theorists suggest that for 90 seconds, the boundaries between worlds blurred. The pilot's voice, steady and professional, crossed into our reality without intention, carried like a stray signal bleeding across frequencies. The result was not a message sent deliberately, but a rare overlap between timelines, two versions of reality brushing against one another. Critics argue this interpretation belongs more to science fiction than science. Parallel universes remain theoretical, with no empirical proof. But physicists acknowledge that the mathematics of quantum theory does not forbid them. Indeed, Some models almost demand their existence. If such worlds exist, the next question is whether they can interact. Could a plane step from one to another, not by design but by accident, pushed through by conditions we cannot yet define? Theories of electromagnetic anomalies and geomagnetic zones sometimes merge with this idea. Perhaps, proponents argue, there are regions where the fabric of reality thins, where energies distort not only instruments but the boundary between timelines. In such places, a vessel might slip not into the ocean, not into the earth, but into a parallel track of existence. For families of the lost, the hypothesis is both haunting and strangely hopeful. It suggests their loved ones did not die, but continued, alive in a world adjacent to ours. A daughter of one passenger once said, "Maybe he's still having breakfast somewhere, thinking it's 1971, never knowing I grew old without him." The thought is devastating, but it carries a sliver of comfort. Survival, even if unreachable. Skeptics counter that the hypothesis explains too much. If every disappearance is written off as a shift to another universe, then no mystery can ever be solved. It becomes a catch-all, immune to testing, unfalsifiable by evidence. Yet even skeptics admit the poetic resonance. The idea that silence, absence, and impossible voices might point to hidden layers of reality. The 1971-2004 case remains one of the most compelling to feed this speculation. A jet that left no wreckage, a voice that returned decades later, a machine that should not have existed still humming in the background. In the end, the parallel universe hypothesis is less a conclusion than a mirror. It reflects our longing to reconcile loss with possibility, grief with hope. Whether science will one day confirm or dismiss it, the mystery endures, and as long as a pilot's calm voice echoes across years it should not bridge, some will continue to wonder. Perhaps they did not vanish at all, perhaps they only slipped sideways, into a world still waiting for their arrival. Another theory suggests strong electromagnetic anomalies can trap objects in suspended fields. If such a pocket formed mid-flight in 1971, the jet could have been held until conditions released it in 2004. Electromagnetic time pockets are a speculative idea, born from the observation that certain regions of Earth's atmosphere and magnetic field behave unpredictably. Pilots have reported compasses spinning, altimeters freezing, and radios erupting in static while flying through clear skies. Submariners, too, have logged magnetic surges underwater, strong enough to scramble navigation systems. These disturbances are usually brief, but some researchers wonder, what if they could be more powerful, more sustained enough to bend not only instruments but time itself? The hypothesis imagines a localized field forming under rare conditions, perhaps where geomagnetic anomalies meet atmospheric ionization. Within this pocket, normal chronology could be distorted, like a clock submerged in a magnetic storm. An aircraft caught inside might experience no disruption at all, its crew continuing routine flight, unaware that outside, decades were passing. From their perspective, time would remain smooth. From ours, the jet would vanish, suspended until the field dissipated and released it once more. In this view, the 2004 transmission was not the voice of the dead or the echo of an old recording. It was live, carried forward from the moment of entrapment. The crew believed they were still in 1971, holding steady and calm skies, reporting routine headings. The 90-second intercept was the window when their pocket intersected with our reality before closing again, returning them to a liminal state. Evidence for such fields is circumstantial but intriguing. Satellite data occasionally records sudden spikes of electromagnetic energy over specific oceanic corridors. These bursts have been linked to auroras, solar flares, and seismic activity beneath the seafloor. While none have been proven to create temporal effects, their power to disrupt radio waves and navigation systems is undisputed. Researchers point out that if energy can bend electromagnetic signals, perhaps, under extraordinary conditions, it could bend the passage of time itself. Supporters note that this theory explains why no wreckage was ever found. The jet did not crash. It was simply removed from the flow of time. It also accounts for the technical accuracy of the 2004 broadcast the background hum of turbojets, the phrasing consistent with Cold War-era aviation. These were not reconstructions. They were preserved in a pocket that shielded them from the decades that followed. Skeptics, however, remain firm. Physics recognizes time dilation in extreme environments near black holes at relativistic speeds, but not in mid-air pockets on Earth. The energy required to hold an object for 33 years, they argue, would exceed any natural process known to science. The concept, they suggest, is metaphor more than mechanism, an attempt to clothe mystery in technical language. Yet the persistence of anomalies keeps the idea alive. Pilots continue to report moments of lost time, watches and cockpit clocks disagreeing by minutes after strange encounters. Most are explained as human error or instrument malfunction. But when stacked against disappearances like the 1,971 case, they begin to suggest a pattern too consistent to ignore. For families, the theory is both haunting and hopeful. If their loved ones were caught in such a pocket, they may still be alive, frozen in a suspended corridor, unaware of the years that have passed. The daughter of one passenger once said, "Maybe he never even knew he was gone. Maybe for him, it's still 1,971. Whether electromagnetic time pockets are real remains unproven, but in the silence left behind by the vanished jet, the theory endures. A reminder that even in our mapped and measured skies, there may be hidden chambers of time waiting to open and close without warning. If the plane existed intact in 2004, why was only one radio call captured? Some suggest controllers may have missed others, or perhaps the aircraft briefly phased into alignment just long enough for a single desperate message. The 90-second intercept remains one of the case's most perplexing features. Aviation radios are not designed for singular bursts of communication. Pilots make repeated calls to acknowledge instructions, to confirm headings, to report conditions. A single isolated broadcast without follow-up contradicts the habits drilled into every crew. Yet in 2004, only that one fragment was ever recorded. Skeptics argue that more transmissions may have been made but lost to noise. Radio frequencies are crowded, and signals can slip past unnoticed if controllers are tuned elsewhere or interference blocks reception. Perhaps the crew spoke repeatedly, their voices swallowed by static, leaving only the brief interval that managed to cut through. But experts who analyze the intercept doubt this explanation. Civilian and military monitoring posts in the region record nearly everything, scanning wide frequency bands. For only one call to survive, while all others vanished, requires coincidence bordering on the improbable. More likely, they argue, is that the transmission itself was a singular event, not part of a series. This possibility leads into stranger territory. Some theorists suggest the aircraft's presence in 2004 was temporary, like a shadow flickering across alignment. If the jet had slipped outside normal chronology, it may have brushed against our timeline for less than 2 minutes before dissolving again. In that window, the pilot's words crossed over steady, professional routine. When the corridor closed, so too did the connection. Others frame it in terms of physics. Radio waves require energy, drawn from functioning systems. If the plane existed in a suspended state, its engines and electronics might have flared briefly into operation, enough to power a single call before collapsing back into silence. The transmission, in this view, was not deliberate but incidental, the result of machinery momentarily reigniting after decades in limbo. The phrasing of the call deepens the enigma. Nothing about it sounded like distress. The pilot did not plead for help or announce emergency. He simply reported position, fuel, and clear skies. If this was their only chance to make contact across 33 years, why say so little? Unless, of course, for him it was just another ordinary exchange, unaware that to us it was extraordinary. Families of the missing wrestled with this detail. Some imagined the pilot realizing, mid-broadcast, that something was wrong, that the silence of controllers meant he had slipped beyond reach. Others believed he never knew, that his voice was captured by chance, like an echo passing through a canyon. It wasn't desperate. One widow observed, it was calm, and that calmness is what makes it harder. For investigators, the single message is both a gift and a frustration. A gift because it provides evidence proof that something once considered lost still had a voice. A frustration because it ends too soon, withholding explanation. 90 seconds of clarity swallowed by decades of silence. Ultimately, the question of why only one transmission endures has no answer. Perhaps there were others, lost in noise. Perhaps the plane existed only briefly, brushing our reality like a match struck in the dark. Either way, the singularity of the call is what gives it power. One voice, one moment, suspended between worlds. And in that brevity lies its greatest mystery. Because if a plane can speak once across time, the question is not why it spoke so little, but whether, one day, it might speak again. Imagine being aboard. Passengers buckle up for a 3-hour flight. Hours stretch into decades. Yet outside the window, clouds drift as normal, time unchanged. Inside the cabin, no one realizes the world has raced 33 years ahead. To place ourselves within that perspective is to step into a chilling paradox. For the passengers and crew, everything would have felt routine. The engines droned steadily, the cabin lights glowed warmly, and flight attendants moved through aisles serving meals. Watches ticked second by second, unaware that on the ground years were unraveling at an entirely different pace. From their vantage point, the sky was calm, the flight uneventful. They might have felt grateful for clear conditions, for the smooth ride. Children flipped through colouring books. Businessmen opened briefcases to review papers. Couples shared whispered conversations. There was no sense of rupture, no warning that history itself had shifted beneath them. If time had truly bent around the aircraft, the experience inside would have been seamless. There would be no sensation of acceleration, no dizziness, no physical sign. Hours passed as hours. Meals were served, trays collected, safety cards tucked back into seat pockets. Yet while the cabin lived in minutes, the world below turned through decades. The most haunting element of this perspective is the crew. Pilots checked instruments, confirmed headings, and logged fuel as if nothing were wrong. Their final words in 1971, calm, precise, were not the farewell of men in distress, but the routine chatter of aviators doing their job. To them, the transmission in 2004 was not miraculous or strange. It was simply the next entry in a sequence they believed unbroken. For the passengers, the disorientation would only begin once contact was made again. Imagine landing, expecting to walk into a terminal filled with familiar cars and fashions, only to be met by technology and people 3 decades older. A father, expecting to greet a young daughter, would step into a world where she was now older than him. A mother expecting her toddler might find an adult waiting, carrying her photograph as a memory. Psychologists call this temporal dislocation, the trauma of discovering one's own time no longer matches the world's. Survivors, if they existed, would face shock deeper than grief, because it is not only loved ones that have aged, but entire societies. Languages shift, currencies change, nations rise and fall. To emerge 33 years late would be to awaken in a future that feels like fiction. Even if they had survived only in suspended flight, the questions multiply. Did they age? Did meals diminish? Or were they trapped in a loop, repeating the same stretch of hours without awareness? For those aboard, it may have been the shortest journey of their lives, even as it became the longest mystery for everyone else. Families of the missing sometimes speculated about this perspective. Some said it was kinder to imagine their loved ones unaware that for them, the flight was smooth, uninterrupted, free of fear. Others felt anguish, picturing the shock they would have faced had they landed, stepping into a terminal filled not with familiar faces but with strangers. The survivor's perspective, if true, offers no closure. It only deepens the rift between those who stayed and those who slipped. The passengers would not know they were gone. Only the world knew it had lost them, and so the single transmission in 2004 takes on a haunting resonance. For us, it was a voice from the past. For them, it was simply the present, a moment suspended. Steady, unaware that the skies outside their windows had carried them not across distance, but across decades. Though aviation agencies logged the 2004 incident, official statements were minimal. Files released under Freedom of Information requests are heavily redacted. The absence of answers only deepens the unease. In the weeks after the intercept, journalists pressed civil aviation authorities for details. What frequency had the message been recorded on? Which monitoring stations captured it? Were there multiple tapes confirming its authenticity? Officials acknowledged the event, but offered little beyond sterile phrasing. Anomalous transmission noted. Source under investigation. No immediate impact on safety of flight. The words felt designed, not to inform, but to contain. Researchers who pursued the matter through Freedom of Information requests fared little better. The documents that arrived years later were pages of black bars, with technical sections withheld on grounds of national security and sensitive operational procedures. The fragments left visible contained only routine notes, dates, times, vague mentions of audio sample archived. What should have been evidence instead became a symbol of omission. This silence raised suspicions. If the intercept was merely a stray signal or a hoax, why guard the details so tightly? Why redact frequencies and locations that, in normal circumstances, would pose no risk to disclose? Some concluded the government knew more, that the message had triggered classified discussions, perhaps even military inquiries into the possibility of temporal anomalies. Military involvement, though never confirmed, is suggested by indirect evidence. Declassified logs show sudden increases in monitoring activity during the week of the intercept, with defense communications units rerouted to the region. Commercial pilots reported unusual radar sweeps and temporary restrictions over corridors near the intercept site. Families of the missing passengers were given no answers. Some petitioned for transparency, asking if the voice captured in 2004 truly belonged to their fathers, mothers, brothers. They were met with form letters offering condolences but no clarity. One family member recalled, "It felt like they were patting us on the head, telling us not to ask questions." For skeptics, the silence is evidence of nothing sinister, only bureaucracy. Governments, they argue, are cautious by nature, redacting details not to hide the extraordinary but to protect mundane operational data. Frequencies, monitoring capacities, radar coverage, all are sensitive in the context of security. To release them would expose vulnerabilities, regardless of the content of the intercept. But for believers, the lack of transparency amplifies the mystery. In a world saturated with recording devices and data, why is the clearest link to the 1,971 disappearance locked behind black ink? Why withhold if there is nothing to hide? Silence becomes its own form of testimony, suggesting that the truth, whatever it is, lies somewhere officials do not wish the public to see. Even aviation experts acknowledge that the response was unusual. Normally, unexplained signals are catalogued, studied, and reported openly in technical journals. This one vanished into administrative shadows. Researchers attempting to access the original recording have been told it remains classified. In the end, the government's silence has done more to sustain the mystery than any revelation might have. Absence breeds speculation. Redaction breeds suspicion. The blacked-out files stand as monuments not to knowledge, but to unanswered questions. And so the intercept of 2004 remains not just a riddle of physics and aviation, but of authority and secrecy. What was captured on that frequency? Why has it never been fully disclosed? Until those answers are unsealed, the silence of the skies will be matched by the silence of the state. Universities studying anomalous perceptions cite this case alongside Versailles 1901 time slip and Liverpool's Bold Street shopping glitch. Each involves ordinary people suddenly inhabiting another era. Time slips, as they are called in both folklore and academic study, occupy a strange intersection between psychology and physics. They are not treated as proof of parallel universes, but as events in which perception bends so dramatically that witnesses insist they stepped into another time. For decades, researchers catalogue such accounts not as science fiction curiosities, but as windows into the limits of human consciousness. The Versailles case of 1901 is among the most cited. Two English schoolteachers, Anne Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain, reported walking through the palace gardens on a summer afternoon when the world around them shifted. They described unfamiliar people in 18th century dress, speaking archaic French. Their mannerisms entirely unlike the modern visitors who had surrounded them moments earlier. Later, they concluded they had somehow glimpsed the court of Marie Antoinette. Their testimony was published in a book titled An Adventure, sparking debate that continues to this day. Closer to our time is Liverpool's Bold Street anomaly. Since the 1990 seconds, dozens of witnesses have claimed that while walking along the shopping district, they suddenly found themselves in a version of the street from decades earlier. Shopfronts bore long-vanished names, clothing styles reflected earlier eras, and currency did not match the present. In each case, the shift lasted only minutes before dissolving, leaving the witness shaken but unharmed. Academics studying these cases focus on the common thread. Ordinary people, engaged in routine tasks, suddenly perceiving another historical period with clarity too sharp to dismiss as imagination. Whether these are psychological episodes, dissociation, temporal lobe anomalies, stress-induced hallucinations, or glimpses of realities running parallel to our own remains unresolved. The 1971 2004 aviation mystery is sometimes added to this catalogue, though it differs in scale. Rather than individuals walking into another century, it involves an entire aircraft and its passengers, preserved intact across decades. Yet the similarities are striking. Routine activity disrupted by an inexplicable shift, participants unaware of any change, and sudden re-emergence into a timeline where they no longer belong. University papers analysing anomalous perception cite the case cautiously. In physics seminars, it is raised as a thought experiment. If time is layered, could certain conditions create a fold where one layer brushes another? Neither field claims proof, but both acknowledge the mystery as useful for testing the boundaries of what we know. Critics, of course, argue that cases like Versailles or Bold Street are products of suggestion, memory distortion, or cultural myth. Yet even skeptics admit that the consistency of detail the costumes described, the shops recalled, lends the accounts a stubborn credibility. Likewise, in the 2004 intercept, skeptics cannot fully dismiss the technical precision of the recording. Coincidence and fabrication explain some anomalies, but not all. For families of the lost flight, the comparison to time slips brings an eerie resonance. To imagine their loved ones still seated in a cabin, unaware that 33 years had passed, is to place them alongside the Versailles walkers and Bold Street shoppers caught between times, wandering briefly into another era. In the end, academic studies cannot answer whether time slips are physical, psychological, or narrative. What they show is that the human experience of time is not as fixed as clocks suggest, and when voices emerge from decades past, calm and professional, the question shifts from whether time slips are real to whether we may all, someday, find ourselves in one. Skeptics suggest mass suggestion, faulty memory, or hoax. Yet the audio tape exists, and those who heard it in real time remain convinced they spoke to a crew 3 decades out of place. Psychology has long studied the ways human perception can mislead. Collective suggestion, confirmation bias, and the fallibility of memory all play roles in shaping what people believe they have experienced. When an unusual event occurs, especially in high-stress contexts, the brain often fills gaps with expectation or narrative. This is why eyewitness testimony can diverge so sharply even when witnesses stand side by side. In the case of the 2004 intercept, skeptics argue that the controllers who claim to hear the lost crew may have been primed by knowledge of the 1971 disappearance. Faced with a strange call sign, they might unconsciously link it to the old mystery, colouring their perception of the voice. What could have been a distorted modern signal might, in memory, take on the timbre of an older era. Mass suggestion plays a role too. Once the story circulated, each retelling emphasized the impossible details. The phrasing, the background hum, the call sign of a defunct airline. Over time, these repeated elements could have reinforced belief, turning an ambiguous anomaly into a certainty shared by many. In psychology, this is known as the illusory truth effect. The more often a detail is repeated, the more likely it is to be believed, regardless of its source. Yet the psychological explanation stumbles at one critical point: the tape itself. Recordings strip away memory's fragility, leaving behind an artifact that can be analysed, replayed, dissected. And on the recording, the voice sounds undeniably consistent with 1970 seconds aviation. The clipped phrasing, the analogue hum, the cadence of the pilot, these are not the products of memory or suggestion. They are audible, measurable, and repeatable. Some psychologists suggest a compromise view. Perhaps the recording was genuine, but its interpretation exaggerated. The voice might belong to a reenactment, a broadcast from outdated equipment, or even a deliberate hoax designed to mimic the past. In this scenario, the psychological factor lies not in hearing the voice, but in assigning it supernatural significance. Humans are natural pattern makers. Given a mystery, we reach for the narrative that resonates most deeply, even when simpler explanations exist. For those who heard the transmission in real time, however, the experience was not theoretical. Controllers described chills running through them as they realized what call sign they had logged. One remarked later, "It wasn't imagination. It was there, clear as day." Their conviction stands as stubborn testimony against the suggestion of faulty memory. Families too resisted the psychological dismissal. They knew the sound of their loved ones' voices, and when some said they recognized them in the tape, it was not suggestion but recognition. The psychological angle thus explains part of the story, but not all. It highlights how narratives form, how belief spreads, how memory bends, but it cannot erase the artifact that remains the tape itself, carrying a voice across decades. In the end, psychology may describe the human reaction to the mystery, but not the mystery itself. The intercept continues to resist easy reduction, and perhaps that is why it endures. Because even when minds seek patterns and explanations, the voice from 2004 remains more than memory, more than suggestion. It is a sound that should not exist, yet does. Radar archives from the 2004 intercept show faint blips over open water. Radar, the cornerstone of modern aviation safety, is designed to remove ambiguity. It paints a picture of the skies in luminous sweeps, translating reflections of radio waves into dots on a screen. Every transponder ping, every echo of metal, builds a map of where aircraft are and where they are heading. In theory, it leaves little room for mystery, and yet, in the case of the 2004 intercept, the radar picture seemed to contradict itself. Archived logs examined later by researchers revealed faint anomalies during the minutes of the transmission. Small, intermittent blips flickered in a corridor over open ocean. Their altitude, as plotted, hovered between 29,000 and 31,000 feet, consistent with cruising jets of the early 1970 seconds. Even more unsettling was the path. A near match to the original 1971 flight plan. Controllers on duty that day, however, denied seeing any such returns on their active screens. To them, the skies had been empty. No flight was logged, no transponder identified, no alert sounded. The blips, if they appeared at all, were too faint or too inconsistent to register in real time. Only when analysts combed through the stored data did the echoes emerge, ghostly impressions recorded by machinery but unseen by human eyes. This discrepancy sparked fierce debate. Were the blips artifacts glitches caused by interference, reflections from waves, or even atmospheric anomalies? Or were they traces of something real, present for only moments, captured by radar's impartial lens even as the human operators missed them? Experts weighed in with cautious language. Atmospheric ducting, they noted, can sometimes bend radar beams, producing echoes of objects hundreds of miles away. In rare cases, this results in phantom targets, blips that appear where nothing actually exists. Yet the alignment of these anomalies with the vanished flight's path strained the explanation. Coincidence seemed possible, but difficult to accept. Military analysts, reviewing the data, took a different tone. "The system doesn't invent altitude," one retired officer remarked. "If the return plotted at 30,000 feet, it reflected off something with mass." He suggested the possibility of an unregistered aircraft, though why such a craft would follow. A 3-year-old flight plan remained unanswered. Families of the missing seized on the radar traces as the most tangible evidence yet. "Voices can be explained away," one son of a passenger said, "but machines don't imagine. If the radar saw them, they were there." For them, the blips were more than anomalies. They were proof that the flight still existed, if only briefly. In 2004, skeptics countered that the radar evidence was too faint, too inconsistent to draw conclusions. In aviation, they argued, anomalies abound. Weather balloons, migrating birds, even atmospheric turbulence can produce returns that mimic aircraft. To connect faint blips to a vanished flight was, in their view, an act of desperation rather than science. Yet the question endures. If the radar data was meaningless, why did it align so precisely with the old flight plan? If it was coincidence, why did it occur in the same window as the anomalous transmission? The convergence of voice and radar, however faint, lingers as one of the strongest arguments that something real, brushed against our skies that day. In the end, the radar data is like the transmission itself. A fragment, incomplete, resisting certainty. Faint blips over open water, a voice out of time, both pointing to a flight that should not exist, yet refuses to vanish entirely. Family members petitioned for the 1971 manifest to be compared against possible modern sightings. Several claimed to see familiar faces in airports decades later. None of these accounts were ever confirmed. The passenger manifest of the vanished flight became more than a list of names. It became a ledger of absence. Each entry represented not only a traveller, but a web of families, friends, and lives interrupted. Mothers and fathers, students, newlyweds, businessmen, all reduced to lines of typewriter, ink filed under missing. For the relatives, the list was not archival. It was alive, a reminder of what had been stolen and what might yet be returned. When news of the 2004 transmission broke, families began pressing authorities to cross-check the manifest against modern records. If the aircraft had somehow survived, even briefly, then perhaps one or more of its passengers had resurfaced. Petitions were filed with civil aviation agencies, immigration authorities, and even Interpol, asking whether any individuals resembling those lost in 1971 had ever been documented abroad. Rumours soon circulated. A businessman in Buenos Aires claimed to have recognized a fellow traveller he had last seen in the early 1970s boarding a different flight. In Miami, a woman reported crossing paths with a man whose face matched an old newspaper photograph of one of the missing passengers. He appeared older than in the photo, yet carried the same briefcase she remembered from images published decades earlier. Airports, with their transient crowds and fleeting encounters, became fertile ground for these sightings. Some families clung to reports of familiar expressions, distinctive gestures, or unique accents that stood out across the years. In one striking case, a daughter swore she saw her father at a layover lounge in Madrid in the late 1990s. He was older, his hair greyer, but his posture and voice, she insisted, were unmistakable. When she called out, the man glanced her way and then turned, vanishing into the crowd. None of these accounts were confirmed. No passport scans matched the manifest. No official record tied the names to modern travel. Investigators dismissed the claims as coincidence, fueled by grief and the human mind's tendency to see patterns in strangers' faces. Psychologists point to a phenomenon called facial pareidolia, the brain's compulsion to map familiar identities onto unfamiliar features. Yet the persistence of the sightings is difficult to ignore. Even decades later, families continued to report brief encounters on trains, in airports, on city streets where they believed they had glimpsed the lost. Each account was fleeting, unverifiable, but emotionally powerful. "You don't mistake your own blood," one sister remarked. "I know when I see my brother, even if 30 years have passed." For researchers, the manifest itself became an anchor for speculation. If the passengers were alive somewhere, their names might appear in unexpected places. Immigration ledgers, hospital records, distant phone directories. A handful of investigators pursued these trails, but leads fizzled out, leaving behind only fragments too weak to support conclusions. The lack of confirmation does not erase the emotional truth of the sightings. For families, each reported face was both torment and hope. A reminder that their loved ones might still walk the earth, even if forever beyond their reach. The manifest, yellowing with age, remains a roll call of lives unaccounted for. Names suspended between disappearance and reappearance. In the end, the passenger manifest is more than a historical record. It is a living question. Not just who boarded the plane in 1971, but whether any of them ever stepped back into our world again. Linguists compared the 2004 audio with archived recordings of the captain's 1971 training sessions. The accent, cadence, and vocabulary matched too closely for coincidence. The recordings from 1971 were never intended to be historical artifacts. They were routine training tapes, cockpit drills, emergency simulations, voice procedures for standard flights. Yet decades later, they became a baseline for one of aviation's strangest mysteries. When the 2004 intercept surfaced, analysts immediately looked for something concrete to compare it against. The training tapes, stored in company archives, offered the rare chance to measure voice against voice across time. Forensic linguists conducted the analysis, breaking down speech into measurable components. Accent was the first marker. The captain's voice carried a distinctive regional inflection, subtle but identifiable. Vowel shapes, consonant clipping, and rhythm all aligned with the archived tapes. More than a general resemblance, it was a match in the fine grain of articulation, the kind of detail unlikely to be imitated with precision. Next came cadence. Pilots speak with particular rhythm, conditioned by years of checklist reading and radio discipline. The 2004 voice demonstrated the same clipped pauses, the same pattern of stress on navigational data, as if trained in the same school of aviation thought. Even the phrasing was anachronistic terms that had faded from use by the 1,980 seconds, yet rolled naturally from the speaker's tongue. Vocabulary sealed the comparison. Aviation English evolves, adopting new standards and abbreviations as international guidelines shift. But in the 2004 intercept, the captain used terminology consistent with early 1,970 seconds conventions, down to phrase structures replaced in later decades. Linguists remarked that the voice did not merely sound like the captain, it spoke the language of his era. Skeptics suggested the match might have been fabricated, a skilled impersonator coached with archival material. But experts in voice forensics countered that the alignment went beyond imitation. Subtle patterns of stress, pacing, and micro-timing in speech are nearly impossible to mimic consistently. The analysis showed not just similarity, but statistical correlation across dozens of markers. If this is forgery, one linguist concluded, it is the most precise in history. For the families, the comparison was devastating. Hearing the intercept placed beside the old training tapes was like hearing a ghost speak twice, once in life and once decades after supposed death. Some wept at the recognition. One daughter said, "That was his voice. No one could fake how he said numbers. I grew up listening to that." The since and not befall of the fly, authorities, however, remained cautious. They acknowledged the similarity but stopped short of declaring a definitive match. Official reports used phrases like consistent with and compatible with, carefully avoiding certainty. To declare it was truly the captain's voice would mean admitting the impossible. That he had spoken across 33 years without aging a day. Academic observers noted how the case blurred boundaries between science and mystery. Voice analysis is normally used in courts of law, identifying suspects with confidence. Yet here, when the data pointed to an answer, the conclusion was left hanging. Science had confirmed what common sense rejected. The voice of a man missing since 1971 had spoken again in 2004. In the end, the comparisons left more questions than answers. They did not prove time travel, nor dismiss hoax. They simply confirmed that two voices, separated by decades, belonged to the same man. And perhaps that was the most unsettling finding of all. Not that the voice was similar, but that it was identical. Cases like this tempt physicists into speculation. That time is not linear, but layered. Occasionally, two layers touch, letting voices, machines, or even entire planes slip across. Time, in everyday life, feels like a straight road. Past behind us, future ahead, and the present unfolding second by second. But in physics, the road is not so simple. Relativity shows that time bends with gravity, stretches with speed, and dilates under conditions far from ordinary human experience. If time can bend, some ask, might it also fold layers pressed together like pages in a book? This is the framework behind the theory of temporal collapse. Moments normally separated by decades may, under rare conditions, brush against each other. Where they meet, events from one era may bleed into another. Voices may carry forward. Machines may appear whole. A vanished aircraft might not be destroyed but displaced. hidden in a fold until the pages separate once again. The 1971-2004 case fits this speculation too neatly to ignore. A flight disappears without wreckage, only to re-emerge decades later in a single burst of communication. The pilot's voice is not ghostly or broken. It is alive, steady, reporting routine details. To those who heard it, the effect was not of speaking with the dead, but of speaking with the present from another time. Physicists who entertain the idea point to analogies. Imagine two rivers running side by side, divided by a thin wall of stone. Most of the time they remain separate. But under pressure, the wall cracks and water spills across. For a moment, the rivers intermingle before parting again. In temporal collapse, the rivers are timelines. For a brief instant, they intersect, allowing events from one to flow into the other. Critics warn that such models stretch metaphor beyond science. No laboratory has observed timelines touching. Yet even skeptics admit that physics leaves room for strangeness. Quantum mechanics, for instance, allows particles to exist in multiple states at once until observed. If reality itself is layered in this way, perhaps entire spans of time behave similarly. Supporters of temporal collapse theory note that it explains the brevity of the 2004 event. The plane did not return permanently, it merely brushed against our reality. The call was made, the radar blips appeared, and then the fold closed. From the crew's perspective, no anomaly occurred. For them, the flight continued smoothly, never knowing they had spoken across decades. For families of the missing, the idea is bittersweet. It suggests their loved ones were never lost, but carried onward in another stream of time. They might still be flying, unaware that 33 years have passed elsewhere. Yet the thought also deepens the ache, for it implies survival without return, existence cut off by the very fabric of reality. Philosophers too find resonance here. If time can collapse, then the boundary between past and present is not absolute. History may not be behind us but beside us, waiting to be touched under rare, unfathomable conditions. The intercept of 2004, in this view, was not a haunting but a glimpse. Proof that the walls between times are thinner than we believe. In the end, the idea of temporal collapse remains speculation, untested and unprovable. Yet the 1971-2004 case lingers as its strongest parable. A story where voices spoke across the fold, where a machine from one page of history appeared briefly on another. And as long as that voice echoes on tape, calm and steady, some will continue to believe that time itself does not flow, but folds. For families, the intercept was no scientific curiosity. It reopened grief, forcing them to imagine loved ones trapped in an eternal sky, forever unable to land. In the sterile language of reports, the 2004 event is described in terms of frequencies, signal strength, and radar anomalies. But for the families of those who boarded the 1971 flight, it was never a matter of data. It was voices familiar, recognizable, achingly alive. To hear them again was to be reminded not only of what had been lost, but of what remained unresolved. Grief without closure is unlike other forms of mourning. When a loved one dies, rituals of burial and remembrance provide structure, a boundary between loss and memory. But when someone vanishes without trace, the wound remains open. Families cannot know whether to keep hoping or to let go. The 2004 intercept deepened that limbo, suggesting survival but denying reunion. Some relatives spoke of renewed anguish. A woman who lost her husband at 24, now in her 52nd, said the recording pulled her back into the uncertainty of youth. It was his voice, she told reporters. For a moment, I believed he was still out there, and then I remembered he could never come home. The paradox of hearing him again only sharpened the pain. Others clung to the possibility with a different kind of intensity. They imagined their loved ones suspended in flight, living out a journey that, from their perspective, never ended. One son said quietly, "I like to think he's still flying, safe, waiting. Maybe someday he'll land." For these families, hope became its own survival mechanism. Psychologists studying such cases note the phenomenon of ambiguous loss. When fate is unknown, The mind cycles endlessly through possibilities. Loved ones are mourned and remembered, yet imagined alive at the same time. The 2004 intercept amplified this cycle, creating a cruel duality, undeniable absence paired with undeniable presence. The human cost extended beyond families. Controllers who heard the intercept firsthand reported sleepless nights, haunted by the calm professionalism of a man who should not have been alive. Some described guilt had they missed a chance to respond more clearly, to guide the aircraft home. Though logic told them nothing more could have been done, the sense of responsibility lingered. The wider public, too, absorbed the emotional weight. For many, the story was less about physics or anomalies and more about empathy, the horror of being trapped outside of time, unable to return, unseen by the world you once knew. News articles at the time often framed the case not as a technical puzzle but as a tragedy of isolation, with the metaphor of an eternal sky repeated again and again. The cost also lay in mistrust. Families petitioned governments for transparency, hoping that more information might finally provide answers. Redacted files and minimal statements only compounded the pain. Silence, to them, felt like abandonment. "We lost them once to the sky," one widow remarked, "and again to the state that won't tell us what it knows." In the end, the 2004 intercept was not just an anomaly on tape. It was a reopening of wounds, a reminder that mystery does not remain abstract when lives are attached to it. Behind every transmission, every faint radar blip, were names on a manifest and faces in photographs, human beings who never came home. And perhaps that is why the mystery endures. Not because of the physics or the theories, but because of the grief that refuses to fade. For those left behind, the unanswered question is not, what happened to the plane? But why must we live without knowing? Across Europe, Asia, and South America, reports exist of antique aircraft seen decades after their models retired, always in formation, always vanishing into cloud. Phantom aircraft are a recurring motif in aviation lore, blending eyewitness testimony with the unsettling suggestion that the skies hold memories of their own. Unlike ordinary sightings of unidentified flying objects, these reports describe machines we know, planes, whose blueprints, liveries, and histories are well documented. The mystery lies not in their form, but in their timing. They appear years, sometimes decades, after their service ended. In 1989, residents in rural France reported a formation of World War II bombers passing overhead at dusk. Their droning engines rattled windows, their silhouettes unmistakable against the sky. Yet no military aircraft of that era had flown there in decades. When villagers looked again, the formation dissolved into cloud, leaving only silence. Investigators found no radar confirmation, but dozens of testimonies described the same sight in strikingly consistent detail. A similar case emerged in Argentina in the mid-1990s. Farmers claimed to see a low-flying DC-3, its paintwork faded, its propellers churning with effort. It circled once, as if searching for a place to land, before climbing into a bank of cloud and vanishing entirely. Pilots in the region dismissed it as misidentification of a modern turboprop, but aviation historians noted that no DC-3 seconds had flown commercially in that area for years. In Asia, reports surfaced of entire squadrons of outdated fighters, flying in tight formation along forgotten corridors. Witnesses described insignias from eras long past, glinting briefly in the sun before fading into haze. Always the same pattern, a fleeting glimpse, followed by disappearance, as though the planes had slipped back into a sky not our own. What unites these accounts is not proof but persistence. Phantom aircraft are rarely caught on radar, rarely photographed. They exist in testimony, in the voices of those who swear they saw something impossible. Skeptics dismiss them as atmospheric illusions, the tricks of light and sound on cloud layers. Propeller aircraft, in particular, produce acoustic signatures that can carry far, confusing witnesses. But these explanations stumble against the details, the markings, the liveries, the precision of formations that no random illusion could sustain. The 1971-2004 case often finds itself placed alongside these phantom sightings, a voice on tape instead of a plane in the sky, but carrying the same theme, machines out of time, persisting where they should not exist. Just as phantom bombers fly over fields long after wars have ended, so too did a phantom jet speak across frequencies decades after its disappearance. For families, these comparisons offered a strange kind of solidarity. Their grief, once unique, became part of a broader pattern of stories whispered around the world. If phantom aircraft could be seen in France, Argentina, or Asia, then perhaps their vanished flight was not alone in its fate. Perhaps the skies occasionally reopen, letting ghosts of machines pass through. Historians warn against romanticizing. Many phantom sightings are anecdotal, unverifiable, rooted in memory and folklore more than evidence. Yet even they admit the consistency is uncanny. The shapes, the sounds, the sudden vanishings into cloud all recur with unnerving precision across continents and decades. In the end, phantom aircraft stand as reminders that aviation history is not sealed. Planes that should rest in museums or scrapyards sometimes return, briefly, to the skies. Whether illusions, echoes, or fragments of time bleeding through, they occupy the same liminal space as the 1,971 jet machines that refuse to be contained by the linear passage of years. Whistleblowers allege the tape was seized by officials, leaving only copies that surfaced online years later. If true, what was so threatening about a minute of static-filled audio? The official record of the 2004 intercept is sparse. Aviation authorities acknowledge a signal was logged, but little more. Yet within months, rumours began circulating among air traffic controllers that the original recording had been removed from civilian archives by government agents and replaced with heavily edited transcripts. The only surviving versions, they claimed, were duplicate copies held privately by those unwilling to surrender them. This allegation gained traction when leaked audio surfaced online years later. The tape, scratchy and degraded, carried the familiar cadence of the pilot's voice. Steady, calm, clipped with the formality of 1,970 seconds aviation English. Background hums aligned with the sound of turbojet engines no longer in service, but because the provenance of the tape was murky, officials dismissed it as a hoax. Whistleblowers, however, insisted the online tape was authentic, a fragment smuggled out before the original was locked away. One retired technician claimed he had been ordered to hand over reel-to-reel copies within hours of the intercept. Another, speaking anonymously, said military personnel supervised the erasure of redundant backups, leaving only a single, clean version in classified storage. If true, these actions suggest a coordinated effort not to preserve, but to bury the evidence. The question lingers: why suppress it? If the recording were nothing more than interference or prank, transparency would have quelled speculation. By withholding, officials invited suspicion. Some researchers argue the threat lay not in the content itself, but in its implications. A calm voice from 1,971, speaking in 2004, undermined the finality of disappearance. It suggested survival, continuity, or worse phenomena outside the boundaries of accepted science. Others believe the suppression was less about mystery and more about control. Governments routinely classify anomalous signals, not because they are paranormal, but because they intersect with sensitive systems, radar ranges, military frequencies, monitoring capacities. To reveal too much would expose vulnerabilities. In this reading, the secrecy is bureaucratic, not conspiratorial. Yet even skeptics acknowledge the suppression narrative has weight. Journalists who filed Freedom of Information requests for the tape received pages of redacted responses. Technical notes were stripped of detail, and audio requests denied outright. National security concerns was the only explanation offered. For many, that phrase became a code for concealment. For the families of the missing, the possibility of suppression was devastating. Some had pinned their hopes on the recording, believing it might confirm their loved one's survival. To imagine it locked away or worse destroyed was to lose them a second time. One relative remarked bitterly, "If the tape proves nothing, why hide it? And if it proves something, why deny us the truth?" The online copies remain at the heart of debate. Audio engineers analysing them confirm they carry features difficult to fake: authentic analog hiss, natural fading patterns, and frequency profiles consistent with long-range airborne transmission. But without access to the original reels, certainty remains elusive. In the end, the allegation of suppression has become inseparable from the mystery itself. Whether through conspiracy or caution, the tape remains out of reach, its full clarity denied to those who seek it. And in that absence, speculation thrives. Perhaps the most haunting question is not whether the recording was real, but why those entrusted with it feared the public hearing. A single voice, a voice that, by all logic, should have been silent since 1971. Even skeptics admit the 1971-2004 case resonates because it mirrors human unease. That time is not entirely ours to control. We rely on its steady march. But what if, like flight paths, it sometimes bends? The mystery of the vanished plane is not simply about aviation. It is about the fragile trust we place in time itself. Every departure is a pact with chronology, that 3 hours later will indeed be 3 hours later, that arrivals will follow departures, that the world will hold steady while we move through it. When that pact is broken, the foundations of certainty tremble. The 2004 intercept punctured this illusion. For 90 seconds, a voice returned that should not have existed, calm and professional, as if no time had passed. It suggested that decades could vanish in an instant, that history might not be a straight line but a looping, folding track where yesterday and today sometimes meet. This possibility unsettles because it erodes the boundaries we depend on. Time is not only the measure of clocks, it governs identity. We age, we grieve, we move forward because time pushes us forward. But the 1971-2004 case whispers of another possibility. That progress is not guaranteed, that the past can intrude without warning, that disappearance may not mean ending but suspension. For families, this ambiguity is torment. It denies closure while offering hope, creating a cycle of longing that never resolves. For scientists, it is a challenge, an event that resists classification, defying both dismissal and proof. For the public, it is fascination, a story that blends tragedy, physics, and folklore into a single unresolved riddle. Skeptics argue the endurance of the case lies not in evidence but in psychology. Humans are drawn to mysteries that refuse resolution. The mind lingers on the gaps, replaying them endlessly, trying to bridge what cannot be bridged. Just as the Bermuda Triangle or phantom ships endure in collective memory, so too does this case, because it embodies absence in its purest form. Yet, endurance is also about resonance. Stories last when they echo something universal. This one echoes our dependence on routine. Planes taking off, landing, the hum of engines marking progress across the sky. To imagine that routine ruptured, that a flight could vanish, only to reappear decades later, forces us to confront the thinness of normality. Historians note how the case parallels myths of old. Sailors once spoke of ships swallowed by fog, reappearing years later unchanged. Farmers told of travellers stepping into rings of light and emerging into futures that had already passed them by. The modern jetliner becomes only the latest vessel for this archetype, a reminder that humanity has always feared the instability of time. Media attention has sustained the story too. Each retelling sharpens details, weaving science and speculation together. Television specials, documentaries, and online debates ensure that new generations encounter the riddle, carrying it forward. Even debunkings keep it alive, because to explain is to repeat, and repetition cements memory. Perhaps the story endures most because it resists ending. Wreckage was never found. Voices were never explained. Files remain redacted. It is not a closed chapter but an open question. And open questions do not fade. They grow. In the silence of unanswered transmissions, in the absence of debris, in the fragments of tape that may or may not be authentic. The case persists not because it must, but because we cannot let it go. And so the voice from 2004 continues to echo, not proof, not fiction, but something in between. A reminder that time, like the sky, is vaster, stranger, and less secure than we dare to believe. The last clear words from the 2004 intercept are debated, but many agree on three: steady and clear. They suggest calm professionalism pilots, who had no idea they were speaking to a world 33 years older. The phrase is deceptively ordinary. Pilots often end transmissions with reassurances, confirming their flight is stable, their route correct, their conditions favourable, steady and clear, fit the language of routine, the cadence of a crew confident in their systems. But within the context of the intercept, those words became haunting, because they implied normality in a situation that was anything but. Audio engineers who replayed the tape noted how the words were delivered. Clipped, even without hesitation. No tremor of fear, no indication of stress. For the crew, this was simply another position report, offered into the airwaves with the expectation of acknowledgement. That none came would not have seemed unusual at first. Controllers sometimes take moments to respond. Yet the silence they met was not from delay, but from decades. For those who heard it live in 2004, the calmness was what unsettled them most. If the pilot had sounded distressed, the call might have been dismissed as a hoax, a dramatization meant to stir. Instead, it was unremarkable in tone, precisely what made it remarkable in meaning. As one controller later said, "He wasn't asking for help. He was telling us everything was fine." And that's what made it impossible. The ambiguity of the words themselves adds to the debate. Some transcriptions render them as "steady on course" or "clear skies ahead." Variations exist because of static, distortion, and overlapping noise on the channel. But the essence remains the same. Confidence, stability, clarity. Not the words of a crew aware of anomaly, but of one continuing a flight uninterrupted. For families, these final words carried heavy symbolism. They became a last message of sorts, an unintentional farewell framed in professionalism. One widow described them as a gift. "At least I know his last words weren't fear. He was calm. He was steady." Others, however, found the phrase unbearable, a reminder that their loved ones might have been alive, unaware that the world they spoke into no longer matched their own. Investigators saw in the phrase a clue to the nature of the event. If the crew believed they were steady and clear, then their instruments must have shown normal function. Fuel estimates, headings, and altitudes all fit the profile of an aircraft mid-flight. In other words, they were not reporting from distress, but from continuity, an aircraft that had never stopped flying. Philosophers and writers found metaphor in the phrase. Steady and clear became a reflection of humanity's relationship with time, our attempt to remain calm in the face of forces we cannot control. To be steady in an unsteady universe, clear when the world blurs, is the essence of survival. That the words emerged from a cockpit, thought lost to history, only deepened their resonance. Skeptics argue the phrase has been romanticized, its ordinariness inflated into mystery. To hear such mundane words across such an extraordinary gap is to confront the strangeness of continuity itself, that routine can echo across decades unchanged. In the end, steady and clear is less a technical report than a lingering imprint. It is the calm voice of professionals at work, suspended between eras, and it endures because it captures the paradox of the case itself, an impossible message delivered in the most ordinary way. For some, it is closure. For others, it is torment. But for all, it is unforgettable, the last words of a flight that should have ended long ago, still holding steady, still impossibly clear. Like the jet itself, the mystery remains airborne. It neither crashes nor lands, suspended between fact and speculation. Perhaps one day, another transmission will break the silence. Until then, the unanswered call lingers, like an echo from skies that should be empty. Every aviation disappearance leaves behind two questions. Where did they go? And why did no one see them go? For the 1,971 flight, these questions remain unanswered, and the 2004 intercept only deepened them. Instead of closure, it added a new layer, proof of presence without proof of return. A voice carried across decades with no explanation of how or why. The case resists resolution because it exists in a liminal space. It is not fully folklore because audio, radar, and records anchor it in fact. Yet, it is not fully science because no theory has bridged the gap between disappearance and transmission. It hovers, like the plane itself, between categories impossible to dismiss, impossible to confirm. Historians compare it to legends of phantom ships, seen centuries after their recorded wrecks, or to medieval tales of travelers stepping into enchanted woods and emerging into futures beyond their own. In each, the theme is the same. Journeys that refuse to end, travelers suspended outside the clock, stories that will not conclude. The modern jetliner is simply the latest vessel for this timeless fear that time itself may betray us. For families, the refusal of the mystery to land means grief without anchor. Their loved ones remain neither gone nor present, but caught in an eternal in-between. Photographs fade, memories age, but the story insists they might still exist alive in some unreachable corridor of time. For scientists, the case is a provocation. It challenges the assumptions that radar sees all, that time flows only forward, that disappearance always means destruction. Each analysis voice patterns, engine hums, radar anomalies returns with data that fits no conventional model. The temptation is strong to set the case aside, to file it as anomaly, but anomalies are the seeds of discovery. For the public, the mystery endures because it is a mirror. It reflects the unease that modern systems, however advanced, cannot master every force. Satellites may orbit, radars may sweep, but a single plane can still vanish, and a single voice can still return from nowhere. In that gap between certainty and silence, imagination thrives. Skeptics argue the endurance of the story comes from repetition, not truth. They note how each retelling sharpens details, transforming ambiguity into drama. Yet even skeptics admit the case is unusually persistent. Decades later, it still circulates in documentaries, articles, and late-night conversations. Few aviation mysteries maintain such grip, because few strike so directly at our trust in time itself. The mystery, like the jet, remains suspended. It cannot land, in fact, because evidence is incomplete. It cannot crash into myth, because evidence is undeniable. It circles endlessly, a holding pattern in human imagination. Perhaps one day another signal will come through, another voice reporting fuel, altitude, skies clear. Or perhaps silence will stretch on, leaving the 2004 intercept as the sole reminder that, once, the past spoke again. Until then, the mystery refuses to conclude. It remains steady, clear, and impossibly airborne. An echo from skies that should be empty, carrying forward the question that will not land. Where did they go, and why have they not returned?